with her hair disheveled and her expression sleepy. The beautiful blonde enthusiastically began to wake up her brother. A moment later, the girl in red underwear asked the guy what thoughts came to his mind when he looked at her. Our heroine, dressed in a school uniform, happily announced that breakfast was almost ready and there was only a short wait left. The guy appreciated this and realized that the girl is the only person who truly cares about him and loves him, so she will always be number one for him. Sitting on the bed, the guy continued to think about it, although his appearance said otherwise. A multitude of thoughts were swarming in his head, and the young man found it very difficult to collect them together because he understood that in reality everything was not so simple. The next minute, the blonde grabbed our hero and, apparently, began to push or bend him somewhere. The young beauty addressed the young man by name and shouted something at him very angrily, expressing obvious displeasure. While on top of Lee Wai-jin, the girl asked him if he washed her clothes along with his. Lying on the floor, the guy thought that this was his reality, which he didn't like at all, because it had many unpleasant nuances. Although, while taking notes in his notebook, the guy called his sister a real queen, the only and best in the whole world. Our heroine looked at her brother with displeasure and said out loud that something very suspicious was happening. Lee Wai-jin, sitting at the table with a silly expression on her face, suddenly realized that she was actually proud to be her brother's older sister. The guy collected the girl's clothes and took them somewhere, after which he heard her swearing and some kind of discontent, which the young beauty continued to actively shout out. Holding our heroine's underwear in his hands, the young man was perplexed as to how a grown girl could ask her older brother to wash such intimate items. The beauty continued to shout something to the guy, and he only thought that, despite all the problems, he was very lucky to remain her older brother. After some time, holding the tray in her hands, the girl asked what happened to the bento and why the leftovers from last night's dinner were still in the refrigerator. The young man grabbed his head and closed his eyes, thinking about what to say and how to behave in the future. Stuttering, the young man began to apologize for this misunderstanding and explain to his sister that he could not cook her a dinner unworthy of her. The young man handed the girl a new tray filled with fruits and vegetables and happily announced that it contained everything she liked. Looking into the container, the beauty began to notice that it contained a lot of low-calorie products, protein and collagen, without understanding why she needed it. Looking angrily at her brother, our heroine began to ask him what he had slipped her, and heard the young man making excuses, saying that he had mixed up the trays. As he said goodbye to his sister, Lee Wai-jin asked her to finally pay attention to him. With a smile on his face and joy in his eyes, he reminded her that he was her older brother, eating perfectly normal food and not worrying about it. However, in the blink of an eye, a box of groceries that the guy had originally placed in front of his sister ended up on his head. Our hero had many questions that he couldn't find answers to, and he didn't understand why he was behaving this way and how he deserved such treatment. Looking angrily at her brother, the beauty told him that he was a loser, and the reason was that the young man could not stand up for himself and that he was who he was. Throwing her briefcase over her shoulder, the blonde threateningly told the guy not to talk to her at school as if they knew each other, because it irritated her. Our hero, taking care of her, stood confusedly in the middle of the kitchen with a tray of food on his head, not daring to take it off. Finally reaching for the tray, he began to slowly remove it, considering his next steps and future behavior. It seemed the guy had been replaced, because a minute later he smiled enthusiastically and noted to himself that his queen was behaving as befits such beautiful girls. The last crumbs of food fell from the boy's head, and he, happy and content, completely forgot about what had happened just a few minutes ago. Lee Wai-jin quickly came to his senses and remembered that the start of the school day would not wait for him, so he needed to hurry. As he prepared to break, the young man thought that his real sister, Vaina, was not who she claimed to be, but the one he wanted to see. This thought haunted the young man, but he did not understand how he could change the girl or how he could influence her behavior in general. While washing dishes, the young man made excuses for his sister, believing that she was not quite who she sometimes wanted to appear to be, because it was just a mask. The very next second, someone's hand touched the guy's shoulder, a girl was sitting next to him and apologized, saying that she was very sorry. The young beauty hugged her brother, burying her face in his shirt and wondering if he was really angry with her. What struck our hero most was the word brother. It seemed he either didn't understand something or something was very unclear to him. But the girl did not give up and continued asking the young man if everything was okay with him and if everything was good with him. The young man's eyes widened. He turned very pale, and only one thought flashed through his head. He felt the touch of a young beauty. Finally, our hero decided to turn around to look his sister in the eyes and perhaps say something to her. Turning to the kitchen table, the young man was surprised to find that the room was completely empty, and he, just like a moment ago, was completely alone. The young man, looking warily into the distance, realized with horror that the same thing was happening to him as before. The sun was shining brightly outside the window, and in front of our hero stood a large, modern, and beautiful building reminiscent of a local school. From behind Lee Wai-jin, a young man's irritated voice was heard, whispering to our hero that he had seen his sister just a few minutes ago. The very next moment, our hero's classmate, with an artistic air, told us what a wonderful life the girl had and what a dazzling figure she had. During the conversation, Lee Wai-jin explained that his sister accidentally dropped his lunch on him, not noticing the question about why he came in a tracksuit. Some guys watching from the side talked about Vi Nu, saying that she was no angel at all and that her character had many flaws. Lee Wai-jin, with a smile on his face and without a shadow of a doubt, stated that his sister is a narcissistic girl, and this is no secret to anyone. The interlocutor agreed with our hero, and Lee Wai-jin, defending his words, once again said that the girl is not like others, and sometimes she is even crazy. Our hero glared at Kang Do-hyun and then stood up abruptly, his expression clearly expressing displeasure and some kind of irritation. A second later, he raised his fist and shouted at his neighbor, accusing him of insulting Wai Na without reason, and, in addition, our hero noted that from now on, this guy would have to watch his words. Lee Wai-jin seemed to have grown considerably in size and become much stronger than the young man sitting next to him. Our hero became so enraged that he absolutely decided to hit the man. A second later, Kang Do-hyun yelled at Lee Wai-jin, and the two started partying, during which one of them dislocated his arm. A couple of minutes later, a voice came from the first aid station, saying that the shoulder had been slightly injured during the fight, but overall it was fine and would heal soon. The victim, Lee Wai-jin, sat with his eyes closed, his face contorted in pain, but also clearly showing shame as the breasts of a charming red-haired nurse hung over his head. The girl standing behind him was surprised that someone so young could have such tense shoulders and added that the upcoming exams could be the reason. After hugging the boy, the nurse added that the tension could be caused by something else, and she would be happy to help the young man with this issue. Our hero somehow got up from his chair and said with relief in his voice that he was a happy man, that he did not have and never had stress. As he was leaving, the young man dropped his diary, which the nanny noticed. When she opened it, she was very surprised, since young men, unlike girls, never keep anything like that. Having returned the notebook to our hero, the beauty thought for a moment before telling him that reading the diary helps her understand why the guy is so worried and where his stress comes from. And the very next minute, the girl casually tossed the fine to the guy, asking about his health one last time, and adding that reading personal notebooks in itself could be a heavy burden. Our hero clutched the notebook to his chest, opened his eyes wide, and grinned. It was difficult to tell from his expression what he was thinking about, or whether he was thinking at all. As Lee Wai-jin left, he heard the nurse nod in satisfaction. But at that moment, he finally decided to ask the question that had been bothering him all this time. As if reading his mind, the red-haired beauty answered his question with a question, wondering if the guy really wanted to know how strange it was to be possessed. It seemed as if the girl was looking straight into the young man's soul, because in her green eyes one could read sympathy, interest, and something that was difficult to understand at first glance. And then she abruptly noted that very often people are driven by obsession, although at the same time, as long as a person distinguishes between reality and fiction, problems do not arise, and everything that happens is considered normal. The young man wanted to add something else, but the nurse put her hand on his head and then began to calm and encourage the guy, hinting that nothing strange or scary was happening to him. The girl said that, hypothetically, if part of someone's imagination starts to seem more real than what is actually happening. But before she could finish her sentence, our hero intervened and finished it by saying that if this happens, then the person begins to go crazy. The next second, they both looked at each other in bewilderment. The guy grabbed his head, not knowing what to say, and the girl was thinking about how to choose the right words so as not to offend the young man. Deciding to break the silence, the young man hastened to reassure the nanny and said that he had not meant himself, but his old acquaintance, but just in case he would like to know what to do. The nurse said that obsessions can actually create a number of problems because it can make it difficult for a person to distinguish between fiction and reality, and it can also change their perception of what is happening. And to somehow defuse the situation, understanding how deeply the young man was worried about what was happening, she added that his friend could come to the first aid station at any time and consult with her. Finally, the red-haired beauty smiled, and our hero, still in shock from what he had heard, timidly thanked her and hastily left. The girl stood in front of the closed door through which the student had just exited. A multitude of questions swirled in her head, but she couldn't find the answers, so the beauty couldn't understand what would happen to the boy next. She asked herself one single question. Did she really think this guy was crazy and that his problems were much more serious than they might seem at first glance? At that moment, a dark-haired girl appeared from behind the screen, unwittingly witnessing the conversation. Turning to the nurse, the girl said that she had actually asked very interesting questions. Looking at the student, the nurse called out to the girl and said that everything she had said a minute ago had absolutely nothing to do with the brunette. The nurse addressed her guest by name, but did not seem to hear her words, as the young woman looked into the distance, lost in thought. The next minute, the brunette stood up and, calling the nurse by name, said that the girl had spoken to her somewhat formally, having heard only a question concerning a specific matter. It was clear that Song Shuren had no intention of continuing this conversation, so she simply waved the nurse off and quickly headed towards the front door. But, having stopped with her, the girl turned around a little and told the first aid worker that for now, they really had nothing to talk about, but the situation could change in the future. Walking down the deserted street, our hero looked completely devastated and confused. It seemed he did not understand or was unaware of what was happening to him and what would happen next. In his large and beautiful eyes, one could read a storm of emotions that were extremely difficult for the young man to show, but even more difficult to cope with and overcome. Images of the nurse kept appearing in his mind, and he recalled how she had sincerely offered to help his non-existent friend. Besides, Lee Wai-jin also thought about her words about possession. Scratching the back of his head, the young man wondered whether he should tell Yuji what was really going on with him, or whether it would be better to postpone this conversation until a better time. It seemed like the guy was about to head to the familiar first aid station, but instead he stopped and began to carefully examine something or someone. In fact, Lee Wai-jin didn't notice that someone was walking behind him, and all because this person didn't try to overtake him or get closer. The stranger kept the same distance. With a displeased grimace, our hero realized that someone was following him, but he still didn't understand who it was, why this was happening, and, most importantly, what the ultimate goal of all this was. Turning around, the young man looked critically at the brunette. He didn't know her personally, but from her school uniform he guessed that this girl studied at the same educational institution as him. A multitude of thoughts flashed through the boy's head. On the one hand, he thought that the beauty was about to confess her love to him, but on the other, he imagined how he would refuse her, because in his heart there lived only love for his sister. For a moment, the boy stared at the girl, unsure whether to say anything or find out who she was. The silence seemed to last forever. Realizing that something was wrong, the guy grabbed his head, trying to get his thoughts in order, and finally, plucking up the courage, asked the girl what she wanted to tell him. In response, the young beauty shrugged her shoulders in amazement because she had absolutely no intention of meeting this guy or talking to him. But before the girl could say anything, the thoughts came to our hero's mind again. Only this time he was clearly assessing the student, emphasizing to himself how attractive this beautiful girl was. The guy's thoughts were interrupted by a direct and honest answer from the girl, who admitted that she had been watching him. The beauty follows the guy to ensure his safety and prevent him from getting too deep into his illusions and fantasies. What he heard made the boy's eyes widen. Surprise, indignation, and a multitude of questions were visible in them, but the young man did not dare say or ask anything. Having recovered a little from the shock, the young man was about to ask the brunette in more detail about what she meant, but he didn't have time because his sister ran up to him from the other side. The girl grabbed the young man so hard that he almost fell over in surprise, and then began to mumble something about why he hadn't waited for her and left alone. The beauty did not give up and hastened to remind her brother that he had previously promised his beloved sister to go shopping with her, and that he must definitely keep his promise. Vaina looked carefully at her brother, then at the girl standing next to him, trying to figure out who she was. All three were silent, and the young man smiled and thought about how tightly his sister was holding his hand, as if she was about to tear it away. Now the brunette's gaze was fixed on the young man and his younger sister. There was a sense of misunderstanding and confusion in his gaze. The next second, the stranger raised her right hand and walked towards the couple, watching as their eyes widened and fear appeared on their faces. However, a moment later, something happened that was impossible to even imagine. The brunette grabbed the secret place with all her strength. Our hero opened his mouth wide and began to scream in surprise. He also abruptly recoiled from his sister, not understanding what to expect from his pursuer. As for the latter, she looked at the boys with some devastation, but continued doing what she had started a second ago. At that moment, Vina spoke up, all in sweat. She screamed and started asking the brunette what she was doing. A moment later, the brother and sister screamed in unison, finally making the stranger understand their meaning. The boys cursed and asked her again and again what she was doing or trying to do. Letting go of her hand, the girl stated in a calm voice that the blonde was a very real person, and there was no arguing with that. But the guy, watching everything that was happening with horror, began to shout and threaten the girl, noting that she would not survive all of this, and that after what happened she would not be able to feel safe. However, no matter what the guy said, it didn't seem to have any effect on the black-haired beauty, because she warned him to be careful. As she was about to leave, the young lady answered the question by saying that Li Wai-jin should be wary of reality and illusions. And then, turning around, she added again that if the young man gave and even once, he would never be able to return to reality. The girl's words made an incredible impression on the young man, because he stood for some time and could not move from the spot, still trying to comprehend the words she had said. It seemed like the guy wanted to think about something else, but the next second, Vaina turned to him, continuing to hold his hand. With interest, but at the same time with indignation in her voice, she asked her brother who this brunette was and what she wanted from them. Li Wai-jin started making excuses, but he realized it was useless, so he quickly changed the topic and began reminding his younger sister that they were going shopping and that he was completely ready for shopping. The girl was clearly unhappy, but decided not to make a scene and therefore, turning away, told her brother that the guy should get ready because she was planning to buy a lot of things for herself. After some time, the brother and sister found themselves near a large shopping center, where people were constantly entering and exiting. It turned out to be a grocery supermarket, and, approaching the shelf with watermelons, the girl asked the seller to find them the largest one possible. Li Wai-jin wondered why he needed a watermelon as he watched the vendor try to choose the biggest one, but at the same time, he decided not to ask again so as not to anger his sister again. The next moment, the girl looked at the package of water and told the seller that they would buy it too. The girl refused the store employee's offer to bring her bottles of water, saying she wanted to take the water with her. The next moment, Li Wai-jin literally crawled out of the supermarket, thinking that he wouldn't be able to carry the water to its destination because it was too heavy. Vaina was about to say something to her brother, but the next minute she stopped when she saw an amazing lip gloss in the display case and decided to stop at the counter. The salesman looked at the young man and the girl, then turned to the beauty and asked if she wanted to try how the lipstick would look on her lips. While the girls were talking, the young man decided that he needed to drink some water to get rid of the heavy burden and make his task a little easier. But before he could finish his drink, he heard Why-Na turn to the vendor and tell him that she wanted to see how the gloss would look on his own brother's lips. The young man dropped the bottle in horror, and then looked at his sister with bewilderment and a multitude of questions. He never expected that she was capable of such a thing. A minute later, with a confused, disheveled look and horror in his eyes, blushing and hiding from embarrassment, Lee Wai-Jean sat on a chair with lipstick on. The saleswoman clapped her hands and tirelessly repeated how beautiful this lipstick looked on the young man. Lee Wai-Jean covered his lips with his hands, and his sister laughed and rejoiced at what was happening. It seemed like she was completely delighted. Wiping his lips, the young man thought that Wai-Na had finally stopped being angry and resentful towards him, and this was very beneficial for him. Less than a few minutes later, the couple was already walking down a busy street. The girl walked with a free gait, pointing the way, and the guy barely kept up with her. After walking only a few steps, the guys found themselves in front of a rather strange building with many windows. Having entered inside and looked around, the young man began to ask his sister in bewilderment where they came from and what they were doing in such an unusual place. Lee Wai-Jean still stood silently and critically assessed the situation, trying to at least guess what his sister might lead him to. A minute later, the boys found themselves in a small room reminiscent of a cafe. The schoolgirls, who clearly knew Vi knew well, were comfortably seated on the sofas. One of the girls approached our heroine and began asking who had made the beautiful blonde stay late. While the girls were talking, the guy, flushed and puzzled, watched everything that was happening, trying to understand what he was doing in the company of women and why his sister made him come here. While Lee Wai-Jean was setting down the heavy bags on the floor, the friends carefully examined the glitter they had bought just a couple of minutes ago and noted with genuine interest how beautiful it was. One thought was spinning in our hero's head. Is he really good enough to be in the company of beautiful women? In the next second, one of the schoolgirls turned away from the conversation and turned her gaze to our hero, asking her friend who the guy she had brought was. Wai-Na introduced her older brother to everyone, and he felt indescribable joy when his sister told everyone that he was actually her brother. Winking at Winya, the short-haired schoolgirl noted that, firstly, she looks a lot like her brother, and secondly, she is probably very close to him. Sipping a cocktail, our heroine wanted to say something, but in response she heard only an incomprehensible purring, for which it was difficult to make out anything. However, a second later, Wai-Na put down her cocktail, smiled, and with a sly look declared to everyone gathered that the young man was her slave. Hearing this, Lee Wai-Jean, like all the girls, turned his head sharply and looked at his sister with displeasure. A variety of emotions were visible in his eyes. The friends didn't seem to be bothered by this answer, although they started asking Vi and I if she was being too harsh on her brother, but she changed the subject, actively asking the girls what they wanted to order. The blonde reassured her friends that they shouldn't worry about money because her beloved older brother would pay for everything. Suddenly, one of the girls turned sharply to Lee Wai-Jean and with a smile in her eyes, told the guy that they had already met at school. The girl recalled that she and the young man met in a science club, which the young man himself confirmed. However, the beauty did not calm down and showered the young man with compliments, saying that she was very glad that he was her best friend's brother, and glad that he came with her. A dark-haired girl, standing nearby, turned to our hero and said in an affirmative voice that they should order something for the guy too. But before the boys could do this, Wai-Na's angry voice was heard, categorically opposing this. The next minute the girl took her glass and took a small sip from it, so that the ice from the glass ended up in her mouth. And after a few seconds, Wai-Na spat the piece of ice back into her glass. After that, with joy and satisfaction in her eyes, she handed her glass to Lee Wai-Jean, who came closer to them. Apparently, the young man was unhappy with this action, as he looked at everything that was happening with a sad expression, as if thinking about his next steps. Noticing the confusion in the boy's eyes, the sister turned to her brother and asked if he was really offended by taking the glass because someone had already drunk from it. But, without waiting for the young man's answer, she looked at him questioningly, and then stated that there was no need to worry, because everything was fine. And, Looking at the girls in surprise, she told them that Lee Wai-jin would do absolutely everything she ordered him to do. However, there was not the slightest expression of joy on the young man's face. He frowned, but did not dare to say anything or object. After some time, the young man approached his sister and silently took the glass of water from her hands. However, the next minute something unexpected happened. The young man, with an impassive look, approached Vanya and in one gulp, poured the entire contents of the glass on her. The girl, not understanding anything, watched with horror in her eyes as the remaining ice poured into her face and onto her head. Everyone gathered froze in place, not knowing what to say, and why not turn to Lee Wai-jin with an angry look. The beauty started yelling at the guy and was about to accuse him of something, but the young man, who was leaving the room, seemed to no longer hear anything and did not care what was happening to his sister. When our hero returned to his apartment, located in a densely populated area, night had fallen on the city. He got dressed and sat in the kitchen, leaning his hands on the kitchen table, thinking about something or pondering something. The next minute the young man turned around and asked himself where he should start, what would be the right decision in this situation. Surprisingly, he smiled and felt a slight twinge of shame, and then thought that what had happened showed how much his condition had worsened. But a moment later the young man laid his head on the table and clasped it with his arms, tormented by the thought that he had greatly offended his sister because he had lost control of himself and could not control his body. The young man returned again and again to the unpleasant scene that had taken place only a few hours earlier and wondered how he should play it out. Suddenly, Lee Wai-jin had an interesting idea. He decided to scold his little sister, even if it hurt her. Sitting alone, but continuing to talk to himself, the young man noticed that before telling the girls everything, he had to prepare thoroughly. Then Lee Wai-jin closed his eyes and smiled, as if he was trying his best to concentrate on something or solve some difficult problem. But the hardest part was imagining my sister in all her glory and thinking that perhaps it was better to write off this whole story as my own obsession. Although it seemed like a very simple solution to the guy, he began to imagine that as soon as Vaina returned home, he would immediately start calling her by her name. Slightly opening one eye, the young man happily thought that standing before him was the one to whom he had just turned in his thoughts. With joy in his eyes, the young man declared that his fantasy had come true and that this was exactly what he really wanted. Our hero saw the image of his younger sister, who was perplexed as to what was happening and why this guy needed all this. The blonde beauty's eyes widened. She was clearly unhappy with what was happening and began shouting at the young man, wondering why he called her. While the beauty was speaking, Lee Wai-jin noted to himself that everything was happening as it should be, and he was counting on such a strong reaction from his fictional Waina. Turning to the image of his sister, the young man undoubtedly told her that all his life he had listened only to her and done what she wanted. But he did this not because she asked him to, but because all her orders and whims gave him incredible pleasure. Lee Wai-jin noted that he would humbly carry out all orders, no matter how difficult and unusual they were, no matter how good or bad the young man's feelings were. But he was ready to do everything. It seemed that our hero had decided to tell the whole truth, and the truth was that the girl had broken his trust. Turning to Vaina, the young man told her that he could no longer act as he had before, that he could no longer do as his brother had done. The image of our hero's sister looked at him with amazement. The girl seemed shocked by everything that was happening. Stuttering, she began to convince her brother that she wanted only one thing. And with tears in her eyes, she continued that the only thing she wanted was to brag to her friends about what a good and loyal brother she had. The girl began to cry, and it seemed that it was sincere, but the young man did not understand how much he hurt her, because he simply told her the truth. But before Lee Wai-jin could think of anything else, he was accused of being very angry because he was not with her at the party, but with some girl. Therefore, all the blame for what is happening lies solely with him, and the younger sister is just a victim of circumstances. But the very next moment the beauty's rhetoric changed, and with tears in her eyes, she began to ask the young man not to tell her that he no longer wanted to be her older brother. Lee Wai-jin clearly didn't expect this turn of events, so surprise was visible on his face and fear in his eyes. He looked at his sister blowing her nose and thought it was very cute, although he did not understand what was happening to his obsession, since it always took on a completely different guise. On the one hand, the young man wanted to stop all this, but on the other hand, he wanted to see how far it could go. So, with anger in his eyes, the young man looked closely at his sister and demanded that the girl apologize immediately. The young man had never seen Vi Nu in such a state. It seemed that the girl had become completely defenseless and did not know what to do. With tears in her eyes again and embarrassment on her face, the young beauty began to mumble apologies, thinking to herself that she could repeat them if necessary. But the guy was not satisfied with her answer. So, raising his index finger, the young man demanded that his sister ask him for forgiveness again, but at the same time say that he is her beloved brother. However, what happened next was not at all what the young man expected, because from a peaceful and kind girl, his sister turned into a real fury who screamed at him with all her might. Looking at this whole scene, Lee Wai-jin was stunned. He realized it was merely a figment of his imagination, but how wildly it had played out, and how everything hadn't gone according to plan. However, literally a second later the situation changed, because despite the anger in her eyes, the girl began to mutter something under her breath, whispering under her breath. Her voice grew louder and louder, and in an instant, Lee Wai-jin heard a sincere apology reflected on the young beauty's face. All this amused our hero, so he decided to go further and began asking the girl to massage his feet. And again the beauty's eyes widened in surprise. Horror was reflected on her face, and the girl again began to ask what the young man wanted. Now Lee Wai-jin was screaming, causing Wai Nu to remember everything she had done to him before and the terrible demands he had to meekly fulfill for her sake. The boy, huddled in his chair with surprise in his eyes, noticed to himself that his sister approached him with a businesslike air, but he had no idea what would happen next. The next second, looking into the eyes of his embarrassed sister, Lee Wai-jin joyfully celebrated his victory because he realized that he had achieved what he was striving for. Having carefully examined his sister, the young man noticed to himself that she really did look like the real Vi Na, and he realized that his fantasy was giving him real pleasure. And after a few seconds, the young man could not believe his eyes nor his feelings because they told him that his sister was fulfilling his request. The young beauty sat in front of Lee Wai-jin and massaged his legs, but the young man was not surprised at how this was possible, because in fantasies such sensations should be completely absent. At that very moment, he remembered the words of the nurse who told him that if the obsession began to seem real, then this guy would definitely need to contact her. The boy also remembered a stranger who told him that the difference between reality and fantasy was too small for him. But at the same time, it was a wall that was very difficult for him to overcome. For a while, Lee Wai-jin and his imaginary sister, Wai Na, looked at each other attentively, not daring to break the prolonged silence. Moreover, the young man believed that he had reached a point where he no longer had a choice, and everything that was happening could not be postponed. The guy found it hard to believe that in front of him was actually an illusory sister, unreal. So he raised his hand and resolutely walked towards the girl to touch her. The next moment, his hand was already grasping her beautiful breast, and Vi Na's eyes showed genuine amazement. With each passing second, the young man moved further and further away, as if not understanding what was happening and whether he was really imagining it all, or whether the girl standing in front of him was real. Lee Wai-jin noticed to himself that the beauty's breasts were firm, which meant they were absolutely real, just like everything that had happened earlier. A second later, the tall figure of the girl loomed over the young man. Her gait and movements betrayed a fierce determination and a firm intention to take revenge on him. The next moment, the girl attacked her brother, waving her fists, and began shouting curses, accusing him of what she had done. The beauty said that she actually felt guilty about what happened a few hours ago, so she wanted to be nice and friendly, but apparently her brother misunderstood her. Vi Na did not calm down and continued to beat her brother, screaming louder and louder and accusing him of what he did, which was, at the very least, an immoral act. A few minutes later, Our hero lay on the floor and admitted to himself that his pain and discomfort were as realistic as possible. And this can only mean one thing. All this time, it was his real sister in front of him, and not a fantasy, as he initially thought of her. The young man's head was all mixed up. He couldn't remember when the real girl had appeared, and whether it was possible that he wasn't just imagining things. Getting up from the floor, the guy did not reproach himself for what happened that evening, but what tormented him most was the realization that he had ruined everything and had not done what he really wanted. Falling to his knees, the young man remembered how disgustingly he had treated his sister, and it seemed that the feeling of guilt was about to break our hero. The beautiful clear weather made it clear that the terrible and problematic evening was over, which meant we could try to make things right. After catching up with his sister, Lee Wai-jin realized that he had overslept, so he quickly hurried to the kitchen, apologized to her, and tried to somehow justify himself. He wanted to say that he would cook dinner a little later, but his gaze froze on his sister, who was looking intently into the distance and was silent. The next minute, the young man looked critically at the kitchen. The mess there indicated that his younger sister had been trying to cook something since early morning, or had even already cooked it. Our hero looked around in amazement and did not understand what was happening, because this had never happened before. Not understanding why Lee Wai-jin was so dissatisfied, the beauty suddenly ran up to him, holding a ladle in front of him and asking what didn't suit him. However, the very next minute the young beauty turned around and grabbed the box of food that was already on the table. Apparently, the girl did not want to continue the conversation, nor did she want to deal with the situation, so, hanging her school bag over her shoulder, she silently left the room. But turning around at the end, she warned her brother to return home immediately after school, and if he dared to disobey her, then in his sister's eyes he would die forever. For a moment, the girl looked deeply into her brother's eyes, and he considered the words she had spoken to him just a few moments ago. While looking after his sister, the young man did not understand why he had to go home straight after school, what awaited him, or whether anything awaited him at all. But the next moment, the boy ran to the table and grabbed the box left by Vi Noi. He couldn't believe his eyes and couldn't understand that the beauty herself had prepared the food for him. A couple of hours later, Lee Wai-jin was animatedly discussing with his classmates what had happened to his sister, while the boys, peering into the lunchbox, competed with each other, wondering if she really did it. The guys who knew the girl well were themselves puzzled as to why she decided to take such a step, since nothing like this had ever been observed before. And Lee Wai-jin calmly explained to his friends that probably nothing strange happened because he is the older brother whom Wai-na loves very much. However, the very next moment, the guys looking into the box of groceries were clearly alarmed by something. Taking a closer look, they saw writing on top indicating that the young man was a slowpoke, and, not understanding what this could mean, they decided to ask the guy himself. He seemed reluctant to answer, so he turned and left, informing everyone that he would not be eating the dinner his sister had prepared. Lee Wai-jin countered that such a meal was too important to him, so he couldn't just eat it. And a minute later, leaving the room and climbing the stairs, the young man thought that it wasn't even that, but that he wouldn't be able to swallow a single bite of what Vaina's hands had prepared. Lost in his thoughts, the young man thought that he did not want to see the young girl suffer, and the whole situation weighed heavily on him, as he was confused by his fantasies and could not distinguish them from reality. As Lee Wai-jin relived the memories of last night over and over again, he tried to find an excuse for what had happened, because he was sure that it was all just a figment of his imagination. The young man realized that in his mind the line between reality and fiction had practically disappeared, which meant that he was rushing towards the abyss at great speed. Looking somewhere down, our hero wondered whether absolutely all of his dreams could come true. However, the next second the young man again turned his thoughts to his sister, remembering her charming smile and such a beautiful and seductive figure. The guy strained himself to the limit and decided that he still needed to try to finally be sure of the capabilities of his mind. Concentrating, the young man began to imagine what he really wanted to bring to life and see before him at this particular moment. It seemed as if our hero had fallen into some kind of trance, because he had distanced himself from everything that was happening, close his eyes, and simply began to wait for a positive result. And the result was not long in coming. In the blink of an eye, a blonde beauty appeared in front of Liu Wai-jin, her gaze captivating because she was naked. The young man looked at his fantasy with satisfaction, noting to himself that in fact he could do a lot, because everything he imagined immediately became reality. The guy understood that all of this was just a figment of his imagination, but was it really possible that his fantasies would actually come true? Even for a moment? The young man remembered how it all ended last time, but still decided to try what was different this time. So he raised his hand and walked towards the beauty. Raising his hand, Liu Wai-jin didn't dare approach closer. He desperately wanted to experience this beauty, but at the same time, he was afraid of disappointment and failure. It seemed like the guy's hand was about to touch the soft, velvety skin of his fantasy, but something continued to hold the young man back, and he froze in place. However, a minute later the young man's hand almost reached the beauty's chest, and it seemed as if he was about to finally touch her. Unfortunately, this was not destined to happen, because the next moment the guy watched in horror as the head of his fantasy slowly separated from his body. For a moment, Liu Wai-jin thought that this was just a figment of his imagination and that nothing like this could happen in reality. It was just his fantasy and nothing more. However, before the boy could fully process the situation, a stranger appeared before his eyes. The same stalker they'd seen just a couple of days earlier. Her appearance was terrifying, and she was holding a knife. The young man watched in horror as the blonde beauty, who just a couple of minutes ago had been completely real and smiling at him, now fell prostrate at the brunette's feet. The guy had no idea what was happening. He couldn't believe his eyes when he saw it. Liu Wai-jin was about to think about something else, but his thoughts were interrupted by the brunette, who said in a sad voice that she had warned him about the consequences. The young man listened in horror to the girl who continued to speak, claiming that all his fantasies and attempts to bring them to life were doomed to failure. After hesitating a bit and raising the knife, the girl continued, saying that all his fantasies had a right to exist. These words captivated the young man, who stood and simply looked at the brunette, not knowing how to properly react to her words and actions. With despair in his eyes, the young man began to wonder why the girl was carrying a knife to school, what boundary she was talking about, and who was driving. And then, looking into the brunette's angry eyes, with a sense of guilt in his voice, the young man asked what he had done wrong. The beauty fell silent, choosing her words and looking at the ghostly figure of Vainal lying at her feet. A minute later, she was already telling the young man that the driver was the one who could make his fantasies come true. Then, looking at the guy with some apprehension, she added that she worked as a security guard. And then she added that such a guard would instantly destroy all his illusions and fantasies that prevent him from living a full life. The young man thought the girl had taken possession of something, because her face became angry, her hair was disheveled, and she herself screamed that she would do everything to crush the guy. The young man did not understand what was happening to him. His gaze became very gloomy. He tried to utter at least a word, but nothing worked. Finally, having gathered his strength, our hero began to shout at the girl, wondering what she was going to do to him, and warning her that all her actions were very dangerous. His words seemed to have no effect on the brunette. Knife in hand, the young woman continued to tell the guy that he was driving, which meant she could kill him without any punishment. Despite all the stranger's arguments, the young man did not understand what she was talking about. He had no idea how dangerous drivers were, what it meant, or why the girl was so eager to kill him. At some point, Liu Wai-jin decided that everything that was happening was unreal and was just a figment of his imagination, unfolding on a grand scale. However, the next minute the girl interrupted the young man's train of thought, asking him to create some illusion at his own discretion. The guy didn't understand why this was necessary, and the guardian girl continued her speech, explaining that she could easily destroy any of his fantasies, so he had to create her. Before the guy had time to concentrate and do anything, someone called out to him sharply. Liu Wai-jin turned around to see Wai Nu, who, with her hands at her sides, scolded him for eating her bento without thanking her for the delicious dish. Both the guard and the young man held their breath and looked with interest at the blonde beauty, not missing a single word from her lips. Once again, the brunette broke the silence, informing both of them of her presence, as if hinting at the lightning-fast embodiment of fantasy. A second later, the girl was already heading towards the young man's so-called younger sister, but it was difficult to say what was on her mind. All the guy could do was keep an eye on his former pursuer, who was quickly approaching Vina with a knife in one hand. The young man wanted to intervene, but didn't know how, so he simply shouted his sister's name loudly, warning her of the impending danger. Although this was of little help, because at that very moment, the brunette's knife hit a box of groceries that was in the hands of our hero's younger sister. Vina looked in horror at the stranger who was doing incomprehensible things. The young girl did not understand what she had done wrong in front of the guard. But before the brunette could raise the knife, the figure of Lee Wai-jin suddenly appeared in front of her, covering his, albeit fictitious, sister. The guy screamed furiously and threatened the stalker, telling her that she would have to deal with him first, and he would do everything possible to ensure that not a hair fell from Wina's head. The young man covered his head with his hands and looked in horror at the brunette, who declared that she would stop at nothing and, if necessary, kill this guy to get to his illusions. The guard did not back down. It seemed like nothing could make her change her intentions. She looked angrily at our hero and quickly approached him. The girl raised her hand, in which the blade gleamed, and was ready to strike the first blow, but at that moment someone's hand touched the knife, and an unknown voice ordered everyone to freeze in place. The next moment the tension eased, and everyone turned their attention to the nurse, who, with a smile on her face, announced that if things continued at this pace, sooner or later someone would definitely die. Despite the nurse's sudden appearance, the brunette continued to hold the knife, now pointed at the red-haired beauty who had just prevented something irreparable. The guard's eyes reflected a whole storm of emotions: pity, compassion, resentment, and misunderstanding. Turning to the red-haired nurse, the girl, with determination in her eyes, told her that she could get rid of Lee Wai-jin, since she had a whole range of abilities for this. The red-haired beauty reminded the blonde that their job was to destroy illusions and prevent accidents. The driver could only be killed in self-defense. Continuing to address the brunette, she called her by her name, Song Shuren, and said that the guard would not be able to cope with the task of saving the young man, even though she was her personal deputy. Approaching the young man, the girl noted that if her competence was defense, then she could do not only this, but much more, because the situation was worth it. Song Shuren continued to stand and look at the red-haired girl, her eyes filled with nothing but anger and a desire for revenge against the young man. Everything could have continued further if it weren't for Vina, who turned to the red-haired girl with horror on her face and screamed at what she was doing to her brother. Now the nurse was not listening to anyone, because, turning to her assistant, she declared that everything that was happening was not a fantasy, but reality in its purest form. He moved away from the young man and, approaching her sister, confidently grabbed her breast, declaring that the girl was real. She knew it for sure because she was an expert in this field. Not understanding what was happening and why some stranger was grabbing her, the blonde began to scream loudly and insult the nurse, shouting the most obscene curses at her. Looking at all this, neither Lee Wai-jin nor Song Shuren understood what was happening, but it was not necessary, since the nurse noted that the young man, as before, was in control of the situation. Not wanting to delve further, the guy's former stalker turned around and abruptly headed for the exit, adding that she had seen the fruits of his imagination, so she needed to break off relations with him. The deputy's words did not offend the red-haired girl at all. She only noted that there was no need to mysteriously hint to her that Song Shuren herself was capable of creating realistic images. For a while, the brunette hesitated and even stopped at the exit, thinking about her next steps. Without turning around, she asked the young man if he was sure that the person standing in front of him was his real sister, Wina. And, as she left, she added that if the young man was convinced of this, then he was extremely pathetic and did not inspire a drop of respect in her. Lee Wai-jin found it difficult to understand the meaning of her words, so he simply watched in amazement as his former stalker disappeared from sight. She, in turn, did not intend to explain anything, but hurried to leave. Left on the roof, the three finally spoke. Vaina, looking angry, began yelling at the assembled group and asking them a litany of questions about everything that was going on. The red-haired nurse didn't seem to want to explain anything. She was clearly irritated, and so she turned to the guys, inviting them to follow her. Yuji said that this is the only way to clarify the situation as much as possible and show Vina from a different side. A short time later, all three found themselves in a familiar room. It was the first aid station where the young man had first met the nurse. With bewilderment and fear in her eyes, the girl asked the red-haired beauty about what had been said earlier. So beautiful, young and sexy, she couldn't believe what she had heard a minute ago, and so she decided to ask the nurse everything again. Blushing and embarrassed, Vaina wondered how her body could be real, how her breasts could not belong to her, when she was an absolutely real girl. Yuji, sitting on a chair, noted that this was not surprising, since high school students have been having a lot of problems with sexual issues lately. She explained that the school had never really asked the question or presented it to young people the way it should have, so she found it difficult to explain. A minute later, she changed the subject, explaining that until now this brunette had been her assistant, but now she was not doing a good job. And to at least distract Vaina somehow, she added that the girl should not worry about her assistant because she would do everything so that she would not bother her anymore. Vaina looked at the red-haired girl with confusion, and it seemed as if there was still some questions spinning around in her head that she didn't dare ask. Although a second later, all trace of fear had vanished, the young girl asked why the deputy sheriff had asked if she was related to Li Wai-jin. Both the young man and the nurse looked at Vainu in surprise. It seemed they didn't understand what the blonde was talking about. The nurse suggested that it was because they were both very beautiful, but Vainu was not satisfied with this answer, saying that they were from the same parents, although they were completely different. Yuji pointed out that being different isn't all that bad and has certain advantages, although Waina's appearance made it clear that this answer didn't suit her. But she was so tired that it was extremely difficult for her to continue this difficult conversation. So, closing her eyes, she said that she understood everything. As she headed for the door, the girl told her brother that she was leaving, noting that the young man had not told her what she really wanted to hear. The young man looked at his sister sadly, sighed deeply, and told the nurse that Vaina had a hard time coming to terms with everything that had happened and, moreover, did not fully understand everything. However, Yuji quickly changed the subject and, turning to the young man, asked if it was true that he had managed to make his fantasy come true so that it would become as similar as possible to everything that happens in our world. The man looked up gloomily and asked the nurse about the question asked, and then he answered gloomily that everything was strange and unusual, so much so that he himself did not understand what had happened. The next moment the young man became thoughtful, not understanding how outsiders could see his fantasy. Besides, he wondered where it would have come from if it had been destroyed earlier. To make his words more convincing, Li Wai-jin looked closely at the girl and said that he was ready to prove that he could no longer create exactly the same illusion as before. Looking closely at the sofa, the young man seemed lost in thought. He seemed to have lost track of time and didn't know what exactly he wanted to see there. The red-haired beauty did not take her eyes off the image that appeared before her eyes, as if reborn from fire. Li Wai-jin also observed the same scene. He didn't understand how this was possible, so he simply watched and waited to see how things would develop further. The next minute, his sister Vaina was already sitting right in front of him, although both he and the nurse knew perfectly well that this was just a fantasy that this guy had managed to bring to life. The girl was extraordinarily beautiful, and the most amazing thing was that it was difficult to distinguish her from her real, living sister, who had just recently been in the same room. The boy couldn't believe his eyes, so he turned to the nurse and asked her if she had really seen what he had seen. With confidence in her eyes and a calm voice, the red-haired beauty quietly said that she was, in fact, dating our hero's sister. And in the blink of an eye, she raised her hand and walked towards the girl who was sitting just a few meters away from her. The nurse jumped up on the couch and leaned over this fantasy girl, happily declaring that she could not only see the young lady, but could touch her. However, the very next minute, the boy's new teacher, as the girl called herself, suggested that he make sure that his guilt was in fact a figment of his imagination. What happened next shocked the young man. He blushed and opened his mouth wide. The nurse sitting on the couch unbuttoned the top of Aina's illusionary uniform and began to talk about how beautiful and realistic the girl was. He continued to examine the girl, who was screaming and resisting, not understanding what they wanted to do to her. The next second, our hero couldn't take it anymore either. He also started screaming and being indignant, not realizing that his new teacher wanted to confirm this, since it was already clear that his sister was a fiction. The nurse assured the young man that he was an illusionist and had created the image of the girl who was now lying on the couch, but she did not stop her research. The red-haired girl herself could not understand how something she had invented and brought to life could be so realistic. A minute later, the teacher asked the young man if he was worried about what she might do to Li Wai-jin's imaginary sister. Without waiting for an answer, the girl walked up to the blonde and continued, telling the young man that since all of this was unreal, she could do whatever she wanted. Confirming her words, she noted that she could have dealt the most serious blow, but it would have been only a blow to the imagination and nothing more. There was obvious horror in the blonde's eyes, because the tip of the scalpel, which the red-haired woman was clutching tightly in her hand, was looking straight at her. Looking at this, Li Wai-jin didn't know what to do or what to say, and didn't know whether he should react to all of this at all. But a moment later, something unexpected happened. With a smile on her face, the nurse reported that the blonde had managed to dodge her blow. A few minutes later, the red-haired beauty got up from the sofa, twirled a scalpel in her hands, and, smiling, looked at the unreal Vai Nu. But then, narrowing her eyes in determination, she jumped sharply to the side and announced that she was going to deliver a blow that would destroy all hope. The beauty ran to the sofa again, jumped onto it, and swung the knife again. But she didn't have time to do anything, because Vai Na jumped off the bed in an instant and stopped, as if thinking about her next steps. The young man didn't like what was happening in the room, so he started yelling at his new teacher, wondering what she was doing. However, she calmly replied that she was simply confirming the fact that our hero had told her earlier. The red-haired girl, looking at the sofa with sadness and surprise in her eyes, noticed a very strange fact. She said that the ghostly Vai Na, somehow, and before the beauty had time to say anything, the blonde stood up from her seat the next moment and headed towards the guys. This was no longer the defenseless and weak girl who had been lying on the sofa a minute ago, but a real devil ready to attack. The nurse closed her eyes and told him, with devastation in her voice, that it was too late and that this was the end for them. The next moment, complete silence reigned in the room. The red-haired beauty sat on the sofa with a sad expression, as if resigning herself to what was about to happen. Meanwhile, slightly opening one eye, she continued to watch the blonde, not intending to let her out of sight. But to the surprise of Yuji, he and our hero, a second later the room was completely empty. Li Wai-jin was looking at his new teacher, and she was looking at him. The young people looked around the reception room again, not believing their eyes and not understanding where the illusion that had just approached them with an angry look could have gone. Li Wai-jin had never seen or practiced anything like this before, so he turned to his new teacher for clarification. It seemed that the girl either did not hear or did not understand our hero, because surprise froze on her face, but, just like a minute ago, she continued to remain silent. In the next moment, she jumped up from her seat and started screaming, either to the guy or to the surrounding space, asking where their fantasy about Vai Na had gone. Hearing this, the young man opened his eyes wide and, stuttering, confirmed that his imaginary and unreal sister was gone. Lost in thought again, the red-haired beauty told the young man that what had happened a couple of minutes ago looked very dangerous. Having woken up from her obsession, she asked our hero whether Vai Na left of her own free will or whether this guy had broken her. Stopping listening to his mentor, the young man shouted at her. Running up to the red-haired girl and grabbing her by the shoulder, the guy demanded an explanation and began to inquire about who an illusionist was in their world and what his role was in all of this. Yuji looked at the young man in surprise for a moment. wondering what he should know and what it would be better to keep silent about. However, she almost immediately started the conversation by stating that in their world, an illusionist is someone who easily makes their fantasies come true. The point is that they cannot distinguish reality from fantasy. For them, fantasy is as realistic and tangible as their real life is for everyone else. Looking sideways at the young man, the girl still wanted to say something, but after hesitating a little, she noted that she would tell him everything else only tomorrow. Our hero started asking more questions, but the nurse said that this guy was one of a kind because he could control his fantasies. With sadness in her eyes, the girl also noted that she would like to get to know this young man as well as possible. But for some reason, this was impossible. To Lee Wai-jin's surprise, she asked him who this guy really was. Night had fallen over the city, but that didn't stop Song Shuren from completing her mission. She was determined, the steel of her knife gleaming in her hands. In a small room, dressed in a maid's costume, sat a young girl who, with a prayerful look, turned to her master and asked him for forgiveness. The man's loud voice scolded the girl and reproached her for opening the door to strangers, although he had previously warned her not to let strangers into the room. In an angry voice, the stranger told the girl not to dare joke with him. The fat man explained that the maid should not obey his mother's orders because she was the worst woman he had ever known. With anger in his eyes, looking around his room, the man nervously noticed that all his things were saturated with a human smell, and it was only the girl's fault. Tears were visible on the young beauty's face. She began to sob and say that in fact everything happened because of her and only because of her. The red-haired girl curled up into a small ball in horror, not understanding what would happen to her next. A second later, the man took a stick and began to shamelessly lift the beauty's apron, making it clear to her that he intended to punish her, but only if she truly repented. Stuttering and crying, the girl barely audibly said that her master could do with her whatever he wanted. Through the small doorway, one could see the dark sky, indicating that night had fallen over the city. Literally a second later, at the beginning of the film, a red-haired nurse and her faithful assistant appeared. Looking at the man, the girl with a stick in her hands quickly made it clear to him that they had come to destroy his fantasies once and for all. With anger in her eyes, she turned to the stranger and added that it was time to wake up and look at this world differently. Hearing Song Shuren call the man an idiot, the red-haired beauty rolled her eyes and smiled, seemingly approving of her assistant's attitude towards him. A moment later, the young maid began to stop the girls, perfectly understanding what they were talking about. She raised her hand to stop the two beauties, and then began to threaten them, warning them that they would be in trouble if they even touched her mistress with a finger. For a moment, horror and surprise froze in the eyes of the maid and the stranger, but it did not last long. The very next minute, the illusion's hand lay on the floor, and our heroine triumphantly announced that it was all over and the task had been completed as quickly and comfortably as possible for her. The man who was watching all this began to shout and become indignant. He was unhappy with what had been done to his maid. However, all his arguments immediately stopped after he put a gun to his throat, telling the stalker that his preferences were simply terrible. And then, with a smile on her face, she added that if he moved, the answer would not be long in coming. The girl explained that guards often work in pairs to counter illusionists, and it so happened that this was her first time working with Song Shuren. The nurse said that the girl's main advantage is that she doesn't care whether she works with illusions or reality. Sometimes it's dangerous, but still, her professionalism is enviable. The fantastic maid, who witnessed everything that happened, smiled naively and said that the guards took only one of her hands. And after a moment, she added that she didn't care how many hands she lost. What was important to her was that her mistress was unhappy with this turn of events. From a sweet and kind young beauty, she turned into an angry and hot-tempered woman, a real warrior, ready to stand up to injustice. But, besides threats, she had no time to do anything, because the next minute the severed head of his fantasy lay at the feet of his mistress. Not believing his eyes, the man carefully examined the head that had just belonged to his illusion. Although now this fantasy lay on the floor, and looked pitifully at its owner, who could no longer influence the situation. Hearing the maid's words, Song-Shuren turned around abruptly and told her to shut up, then added that her knife looked like an ordinary kitchen utensil. In fact, it's a special knife that is given to all security guards, and its main purpose is to destroy people's fantasies and bring them back to the real world. The girl added that without this weapon, it is difficult to call them security guards, since it is the most important tool that they are given. The brunette grimaced in displeasure and ordered the man's former illusion to shut up, declaring that everything had already been decided and the task completed. And to make it all seem more convincing, she stamped her foot and warned her fantasy one last time that it should not have any thoughts or feelings. The owner, angrily watching what was happening, was outraged and ready to burst into a threatening tirade. And, having done this a second later, the man screamed that the girl had mercilessly dealt with his Patricia. The next minute, the man broke into a run and headed towards the guards, his actions full of determination. Realizing what he wanted to do, Song-Shuren quickly reacted and turned to his assistant. For a moment, the brunette froze, as if considering her next steps and how the red-haired beauty would react to all this. But the very next moment, she confidently and seriously declared that whatever she took in the future would be nothing more than self-defense. The nurse, previously so confident and bold, stood and watched in confusion, still holding the gun in her right hand. She saw her assistant grab the knife with both hands and walk towards the illusionist. The girl swung and was about to strike, but the next moment the owner jumped up, intending to enter the fight. He almost attacked Song-Shuren, but she got ahead of him by doing something completely indescribable. A moment later, the brunette froze in place, not understanding what was happening, but what happened was that Yu-Ji-hee, realizing the danger of the situation, pulled the trigger, neutralizing the man. In a quiet alley of a multi-story building, a car appeared, from which 3 people in identical special suits emerged. The cross on the car indicated the arrival of an ambulance. Doctors bandaged the man's wounded leg, put him in a straitjacket, loaded him onto a stretcher, and carried him to a car. The man who had recently seemed so threatening and frightening was now completely helpless, but rage was still evident on his face. As they looked at the departing car, the girls noted to themselves that their mission was accomplished and they could do something else. Or rather, someone else, because the brunette was most interested in Lee Wai-jin. She didn't understand what to do with him, and her partner didn't let her in on his plans regarding the young man. So Song-Shuren once again asked the red-haired beauty if she was going to hand the young man over to another team. For example, Ryu's assistant, Jae. Without waiting for an answer, the brunette began asking if Yu-Ji had managed to learn as much as possible about the new type of illusionist that Lee Wai-jin belonged to. The girl with a thoughtful look said that she had new information. She froze for a second, thinking about something, but at the same time she smiled joyfully and victoriously. She then went on to announce that one of the best illusionist hunters would soon be arriving in town. She said that this is a person from a new generation, that is, young, and besides, he is also a team leader, which is an additional plus. It seemed the brunette wasn't satisfied with this answer. So with anger on her face, she began to explain that illusionists, like everyone else, were only capable of inventing the most obscene fantasies. With sadness in her eyes, the girl added that this young man is a bad guy because he's obsessed with his little sister. For a moment, the girl thought, imagining what could be happening at this moment, and it seemed to her that she was sure of it. And after a short pause, she added that, most likely, it was at that moment that the young man was doing the most disgusting things, fantasizing about Vaina. And indeed, at that very moment, Lee Wai-jin leaned over his sister, looking at her carefully. His little sister's big eyes showed horror and bewilderment, and she asked the young man what he was doing. However, it seemed the guy didn't hear her words. He continued to lie on the naked beauty, who was still looking at Lee Wai-jin in surprise. The same one, without a shadow of doubt and without a drop of remorse, carefully examined her beautiful body, highlighting individual details for himself. He looked at his sister again and again, admiring her beauty and not understanding what to do next. Some time later, while standing in the kitchen washing dishes, our hero heard Vaina shouting from the bathroom, asking if he had seen the towel and if he had left it in the bathroom. The guy took this question as a call to action, so, sprinkling his hands with a pleasant freshener, he hurried to tell the young beauty that he was heading toward her. From behind the bathroom door, Vaina's charming yet astonished face appeared, seeming to be confused by what was going on again. Holding a towel in both hands and with a joyful smile on his face, Lee Wai-jin walked towards the room, called his sister a queen, and told her that she would have everything in a moment. However, the next minute, Vaina opened the bathroom door, leaving only a small gap, and extended her hand, asking her brother to give her a towel. Realizing that something was happening that was not what the young man had hoped for, he winced with displeasure, although he managed to force out the words that it was all quite pleasant. Holding the towel in both hands, he handed it to his sister and politely added that a towel had already been brought for her, and he was happy to fulfill her request. Lee Wai-jin stood there for a moment, looking at the girl's hand, and although he was already smiling, inspiration was clearly visible on his face. But all this did not last long, because the next moment the guy grabbed the goods that he had just handed to his sister and began to tear them into pieces. Not understanding what was happening, Vaina looked in amazement at her brother, who continued to fool around. First he tore the towel and then began to wrap it around her, as if challenging the young beauty to some kind of game. This alone was not enough, so he took the item and tore it into two pieces again, now waving it with both hands. Amazement gave way to anger. Vaina, who just moments ago had been grateful to her brother, now seemed to hate him and was planning to take revenge on the young man. She turned and went back in the bathroom, but shouted over her shoulder to the guy that when she came out, he would be in trouble. The girl's plans were not destined to come true, because the next second the young man either slipped or fell deliberately, and a moment later he collapsed on the floor in front of the blonde. A strange noise was heard in the room, as if someone or something had fallen to the floor. And it was indeed so, because the girl's head was lying on the tiled floor, and Lee Wai-jin's strong arm was supporting her. For some reason, the morning scene repeated itself, because our heroine was lying on the floor and the young man was on top. The young man stood up and scratched the back of his head and began asking Vaina how she was feeling and whether she was hurt. Looking into his younger sister's eyes, the young man read anger, irritation, surprise, and malice in them. For a moment, surprise flashed in the boy's eyes. He thought about something for a long time, trying to find an answer. As he studied the girl's beautiful body, our hero finally began to understand that this might not be his fantasy, but a very real girl, but he did not understand why Vaina continued to behave the way he wanted. The guy was brought out of his reverie by a young beauty who stood up and ordered him to step aside. Having risen from the floor and recovered from the shock, the girl screamed loudly, demanding that the young man move away. Lying on the tiled floor, our hero kept an eye on Vaina, who was quickly moving away from the bathroom. It all happened so quickly that the guy didn't even have time to come to his senses. He realized that he was sitting in magnificent solitude, and his fantasies or reality suddenly left this place. The young man didn't understand why Vaina wasn't angry with him after everything that had happened between them, and it seemed to be beginning to dawn on him that she was a completely real girl. For another moment the young man sat motionless on the floor, carefully considering his next steps. However, suddenly jumping up from the floor and running to the door behind, which Vaina had just disappeared, Lee Wai-jin began to scream loudly and bang on the closed door, begging the girl to forgive him and trying to explain that everything happened by accident. Leaning against the door in despair, our hero heard the girl say, with understanding in her voice, that she knew that none of this was on purpose. The guy heard her voice, but still couldn't believe that it was really his sister in front of him, and not a fantasy that he had once again managed to bring to life. Standing at the door, he repeated his sister's name, wanting to look her in the eyes and explain everything to her personally. Anger gave way to misunderstanding. The young man began to doubt whether the girl was really in the room, trying to fully understand what had happened. The young man called out to his sister, and at that moment, thoughts flashed through his head at incredible speed, hinting that Vaina might be a fictional character. That's why it was so important for our hero to take another look at the girl. He needed to make sure whether she was real or not. The guy seemed to get furious and started knocking on the door again, asking why not if she was really in the room or she might not be there. The young man put in a lot of effort. It seemed that in the next second he would break down the door. It was so important for him to understand what was happening and, most importantly, to bring his thoughts and fantasies to life. Suddenly, the door opened, and in the doorway appeared the beautiful leg of a young beauty. Still standing behind the door, ordered her brother to be silent. Walking into the room, Vaina proudly ordered her brother to shut up once again. But instead of entering into a discussion or trying to find out something, he pulled the girl towards him in one movement and hugged her tightly. His face showed pain, disappointment, and despair. The boy sadly called the girl's name, still not believing his eyes. He hugged his sister tightly, said that he was very glad to see her, pleased that she still listened to him, and left. Our hero's sister's face noticeably softened. Now compassion and understanding were visible on it. However, instead of words of sympathy, the young woman told the young man that he had gone a little crazy and that this worried her. The young man's eyes filled with tears, still afraid to let go of his sister. He repeated that he had to get out of this situation and was obliged to fix everything. The guy, as if explaining to his sister, continued that he had no desire whatsoever to continue his fantasies. He did not want them to become part of his reality again. It was the dead of night outside, but someone still couldn't sleep. Someone said that in a certain situation, no one would likely believe him now. The voice continued to say that only 2 people knew about what happened, and one of them was convinced that some girl could be cruel. Our nurse on the other end of the line was telling someone that she wasn't sure she could solve the problem because it had gone too far. The voice on the phone continued to convince the red-haired beauty that the target was alive and physically fine, so we could try to do something. The man sitting on the chair asked Yuji if there was any problem with the hospitalization. He assumed the man was already in the hospital, and from the conversation, it was clear that he was talking about the owner, whom the girls had ruled out earlier. Continuing the conversation, the stranger praised the red-haired beauty, but at the same time noted that quite a few incidents had occurred recently. The nurse noted that the illusionists were actually causing a lot of trouble, and they were already fed up with it, while the girl was eagerly awaiting what would happen to the man who would be sent to the hospital. At the end of the conversation, the stranger asked Yuji, no matter what, to try to be as careful as possible and watch her every step. An ambulance was visible on the night highway, the front part of which was burning and smoking. Inside the car was a man whom the girls had neutralized several hours earlier. He thought he would die there, since there had been an accident and the car had already started to burn. Looking into the distance with clouded eyes, he did not understand why he ended up in this place and what he did wrong. A second later, a girl appeared in front of him, wondering if the man wanted revenge for what the guards did to his Patricia. Without waiting for an answer, the girl cut the belts that bound the man. Once freed, he began to scream and swear, saying that he would do everything possible to destroy these 2 strangers. Staring into the night distance, the man listened attentively to his liberator, who told him that they possessed the power of illusionists and would give him the opportunity to change his life for the better. She then extended her hand and offered to join her and her team, and the man silently gave a satisfactory response. The blonde looked beautiful against the backdrop of the burning car, but there was some danger lurking in all of this. Standing in the schoolyard, Li Wai-jin thought that he shouldn't do what he had been thinking about all last night. But the next moment he awkwardly opened the door and, stuttering, began to mumble apologies under his breath. There was genuine horror in his eyes. He said that he could not remain in this state. There was a nurse we knew in the room, and upon hearing familiar voices, she became furious with indignation, not understanding why the young man had come. Yuji, who was sitting at the table, was just telling her assistant that some order had been given, but she had not given it. Seeing the young man in the doorway, the red-haired beauty smiled. It seemed she was genuinely glad to see our hero. The nurse extended her hand and told the young man the good news. He had a new friend. Looking at Song Shuren, she quickly stated her name, making it clear who they were talking about. Grabbing the guy by the hand, the red-haired beauty said that from now on, Li Wai-jin would go everywhere with the brunette, to to classes at school, to lunch, and even on the way home. The nurse didn't seem embarrassed by what was happening, so she adjusted the frames of her glasses and looked closely at the boys. Turning to her assistant, the beauty explained that the girl must protect her goal, since the young man had already realized everything, but he could still turn his illusions into reality, and besides, he was a unique case. The brunette's face clearly showed displeasure, but the red-haired beauty assured the girl that this was an order from the department head, so she could not refuse to carry out the task. He said she wouldn't mind watching this guy, but if she started doing it herself, the situation would look extremely strange, like a nurse watching a student. The girl's words clearly had the desired effect on Song Shuren, who lowered her head, frowned, and said that she agreed. The nurse smiled, but the young man standing next to her did not understand why all this was necessary, because he was an ordinary schoolboy. The guy wanted to say something, but didn't have time because the security guard intervened and happily declared that if Lee Wai-jin did anything unusual, she would be happy to get rid of him. A couple of minutes later, the young man and his new bodyguard left the office, and the red-haired beauty, who had been watching the whole time, was clearly worried about something and decided to remain silent. The girl believed that the young man's existence should be kept secret, and this is exactly what she talked about at night with the head of the department. He warned the nurse that this guy might be the one they were looking for, but as for the girl, she finally threw away all her prejudices about illusionists. He didn't agree with her boss's opinion, and therefore continued to watch the young man walking peacefully down the street. She understood that the situation was difficult, and no one knew how it would develop further. So I kept thinking over and over again that all of this was causing everyone maximum inconvenience. The young man walking in front decided that he needed to somehow defuse the situation and make friends with his guard. Smiling, the young man asked if the girl was really a security guard, and then asked if that meant her job was like that of a secret agent. And the result was not long in coming. But it was not at all the result that our heroine was counting on, because the blonde angrily declared that Lee Wai-jin did not dare talk to her. For the first time in his life, the young man was upset. He thought that no one had ever treated him so rudely. But the next minute he decided to make fun of the beauty and, with a smile, began to say that the position of deputy is a high position because it is practically an assistant to the boss. And without stopping, he continued to say that the girl probably occupied a higher position than an ordinary teacher, of which they probably had plenty. The guard's expression was unintelligible. It seemed the girl had decided to maintain a neutral stance. However, this did not stop our hero, and he again turned to his protector, who continued to stand with her back to him. It seemed the ice had melted, because the brunette began to tell our hero who she really was. The girl said she was a deputy sheriff, but the main nuance was that she managed to become the youngest deputy sheriff in history. For a moment the young man froze, his eyes filled with surprise and a multitude of different questions. The young man decided to praise his defender and began to say that it was very good to be such a young deputy, and that she probably had a lot of experience. Turning around, the brunette said that over the past 5 years, she had managed to destroy a large number of illusionists like Lee Wai-jin. Slightly embarrassed, the boy still found the answer and told his new friend that he would like to ask the teacher exactly this question today, but he did not have such an opportunity. In his defense, he added that he was not going to create grandiose illusions and, if necessary, was even ready to seek medical attention. A moment later, with sadness in his voice, Lee Wai-jin told the guard with all sincerity that he didn't want her to see him as a monster. The girl looked the young man in the eyes and didn't know what to answer. It seemed that for the first time in a long time she understood him and even sympathized with him a little. Then, looking into the confused eyes of our hero, she told him that if this became possible, then soon there would not be a single illusionist left in the world. And, again turning her back to the young man, she added that as long as the young man sees his older sister as a girl, she stops again. Then she added sharply that as long as this continued, he would not be able to get rid of his fantasies. Moreover, they would gain momentum. And so that the young man would not have any false hopes, she added that he was a worthless person because he was guided not by common sense, but by an unhealthy imagination. In the blink of an eye, Lee Wai-jin caught up with his friend and grabbed her hand sharply. The guy was incredibly excited, so without saying a word or explaining, he pounced on the girl and began to twist her arms. The young man pressed his protector against the wall, and she only thought that she should somehow resist him, but did not even have time to pull out the knife. The guard looked at the young man with bewilderment, considering her next steps, considering that she was now fulfilling the role of protector. And the guy, squeezing the girl's wrist tighter with each passing second, shouted at her and told her not to say another word about his sister. This could have continued further, but the guard asked the young man if he was really Wai Na's brother. However, Lee Wai-jin looked closely at the beauty and told her that she really didn't know anything. As he left, our hero shouted to his protector that if she had known him, she would never have said what she said. Now the brunette did not understand what was happening. She looked closely at the young man walking in front of her. It turned out that the girl wanted revenge, as she suddenly sped up and ran after Lee Wai-jin. The next second, the brunette waved her hand and was about to hit the guy, but before that happened, for some reason she shouted at him, ordering him to dodge. The young men began to fight, but there was so much dust around that nothing could be seen. The girl was beating up a guy who was already sitting on the ground, and it was quite possible that she had more intentions than she could allow herself to. Sitting motionless on the ground, rubbing his head and looking at his wounded hands, Lee Wai-jin asked the guard why she insulted him. The brunette, lying in the guy's arms, did not have time to answer, but there was no need because the guy began to address her with a trembling voice, pronouncing her name. Song Shuren sat motionless. It was hard to say what she was thinking at that moment. It was quite possible that she didn't hear or didn't want to hear this guy. In the rays of the sunny day, the figure of a red-haired young lady appeared, asking her master for forgiveness in a gloomy voice. She stood defenseless on the road, holding some kind of long stick in her hands, and with sadness on her face, she justified herself, saying that she had not managed to kill the enemy, although she really wanted to. The next minute her face became more joyful, but she did not calm down and again asked her master for forgiveness. The fat man, leaning against the column, said with satisfaction in his voice that the most important thing for him was Patricia. Everything else did not matter. The owner crossed his arms over his chest and said in a threatening voice that he would never lose the girl again because she was very important to him. The boy and girl, who had been sitting on the ground all this time, finally turned their heads, and the brunette, amazed by what she saw, said that there was another illusionist in front of them. Our guard squinted and looked closely at the fantasy girl and realized that she was an illusion of the one who had been destroyed just a couple of hours ago. However, the one who listened attentively to his defender did not understand how it happened that the fantasy, destroyed before the eyes of the illusionist, was reborn and continued to do what it had done before. With a joyful cry, the fat man spread his arms and, taking off his jacket, announced that he was no longer the same person he had been yesterday because he had finally regained clarity of mind. Holding the staff in his hands and heading somewhere forward, he mentally repeated the same words as the owner a minute ago, and this confirmed that his imagination had also changed. The next minute, the girl, leaning on a stick, rose into the air, doing everything possible to attract attention. She smiled and told everyone present that she had completely changed. Yesterday she was one girl, and now she was a completely different one. Realizing that danger was very close, our guard grabbed the young man by the arm and dragged him along, saying that they needed to escape as quickly as possible. Realizing that the boys were running away, Patricia turned to her master and asked why he was standing there, since they needed to catch up with the fugitives. The fantasy girl didn't understand why they were standing there, but her master calmly said that now was not the time to give chase. The fat man seemed to enjoy the fact that Song Shuren and Li Wing were afraid of him, and therefore tried to hide as quickly as possible. He thought about how terrible it was to be a victim, but also how good it was to be a hunter who decided for himself where and whom to go after. And at that moment, across the street, clinging to each other, the guard and his charge ran with all their might, as if they had never run. The young man wondered if this was really an illusion, since fictional characters are seen only by those who created them, and no one else. Song Shuren wanted to say something, but before she could, she screamed, the pain clearly showing on her face. The young man saw that she suddenly sat down on the ground and bowed her head and asked if everything was okay with the girl. But the next second he noticed how the brunette covered her bloody shoulder with her hand, and, seeing a large amount of blood, he realized that the wound was serious. Watching what was happening in horror, Lee Wai-jin began to say that all this happened only because of him, not wanting to listen to what the girl was telling him. Raising her head, the beauty looked seriously at her charge and told him that everything happened only because she was ordered to protect the boy. The next moment, Song Shuren stood up and walked forward, demanding that the young man follow her. The brunette froze for a moment, and then said that if the young man died, a real catastrophe would occur, so she must do everything possible to arrest the illusionist and eradicate his fantasy. Turning again to our hero, she asked him not to ask questions, but simply to follow her silently. The girl realized that Lee Wai-jin would most likely not be satisfied with her answer, so she frowned in displeasure. And then, turning around, she grabbed the young man and began asking him if he really wanted to say that he was ready to sacrifice himself for her. She reminded the young man that they had once had an interesting conversation during which the guy asked a question, and she left it unanswered. This question was about whether she had any sisters or brothers. The girl lowered her head before saying something important, and then, with sadness and bitterness, said that she really did have relatives before. For some time the young people stood and looked at each other, none of them daring to break the silence. The guard was the first to speak, saying that despite some time having passed, she still could not forgive the illusionist. The beauty further noted that she would not accept the death of a person at the hands of someone worthless, for example, because of an unrealistic fantasy. While the girl was looking into the distance, the young man began to ask her what illusion they were talking about. However, the conversation was interrupted the next second when Song Shuren spotted a fat man and his wife, Patricia, approaching them very quickly. She realized this would be difficult. It didn't matter whether they were real or not. The guard decided not to say out loud what was already obvious. These two had managed to catch up with our heroes. The illusionist adjusted his assistant's hand and asked what they would do next. Patricia grabbed her master's hand and smiled happily, and he told her about his fantasy that there shouldn't be any problems with the guys. The red-haired girl looked at the illusionist with a smile and told him with love in her voice that he was her teacher. A minute later, Song Shuren was in full combat readiness, and the young man shouted after her why she needed a kitchen knife and what she could do with it. Patricia also noticed this weapon, thinking to herself that her rival really had a good bladed weapon. Hearing her charge's question, she calmly answered him, saying that a knife can cut anything, no matter whether it is an illusion or reality. Patricia heard the boys' conversation very clearly. The girl smiled sarcastically, clutching her braid to herself, and thought that it was unknown who would win. And then, with joy in her voice, turning to our security guard, she offered to check who she really was and whether she was a master in her field. The next moment, Patricia grabbed her weapon and began swinging it with all her might, trying to demonstrate her superiority. During the spin, Song Shuren also did not sit idle and began to move toward her opponent. As she soared into the sky, our heroine thought that the level of organization was completely different, although at that moment it was unclear who she was thinking about. As the guard performed his trick, she truly realized that the opponent standing before her was not the same opponent she and her teacher had defeated yesterday. The girl noted to herself that it doesn't matter to the knife who it destroys, because it is a sacred object endowed with the power of different religions. She also emphasized that the existence of this bladed weapon contradicts all laws of physics, since there is nothing like this knife in the world. Falling to the ground, Song Shuren looked again at Patricia, who was also standing on the ground, but did not release her weapon. Lee Wai-jin watched everything that was happening in horror, not knowing if he would actually witness this battle. Before the attack, the brunette recalled a story in which the knife had done its job perfectly, and so, without hesitation, she gripped the handle tighter and walked towards her opponent, demonstrating with her whole appearance that she was ready for battle. A moment later, The blade of the knife grazed Patricia's braid, and it seemed as if something unusual was about to happen. But the girl could do nothing. She hit the red-haired girl's weapon again and again, but the desired effect was not observed, and this infuriated our guard. Realizing that something unexpected was happening, the brunette said with anger in her voice that her knife had most likely become dull. Realizing the predicament she was in, Song Shuren stepped aside for a moment to gather her thoughts and devise a new plan. She saw her rival waving her staff triumphantly, demonstrating all its strength and power. Standing to the side, the guard began to think that her weapon had somehow lost its power. Horror was evident on the brunette's face. She tried to collect her thoughts and even began to remember some story. However, the very next second, she heard her charge loudly shouting her name. The guy understood that everything could end sadly, so just in case he warned the girl about the impending danger. The next moment, something unexpected happened for everyone present on the street. With one movement, the guy found himself in front of his protector. He seemed to have turned into some kind of superhero, because in an instant he managed to throw off his backpack and fly up to the guard. She, in turn, opened her mouth in amazement and could only utter the name of our hero. At that moment, she was incapable of anything else. Song Shuren quickly came to her senses and began asking the young man if he was okay and if he was injured. The young man wanted to say something, but all his attention was focused on Patricia, who was standing nearby. She wanted to ask something, probably not understanding why this guy did this, but decided to remain silent. But a moment later the owner spoke up, not knowing what the plan was or whether the boy would interfere with its implementation. But having received the necessary answer, he fell silent. Patricia, who had been thirsting for revenge for several hours, decided that now was the perfect moment to destroy both the guy and the guard. While the boys were solving their problems, someone was talking on the phone, asking if the older brother had returned home. It was Weina who complained during a phone call that Li Weijin not only didn't show up, but didn't even answer his calls. The girl assumed that her brother was unlikely to stay late in any establishment. But before our heroine could finish speaking, the line went silent and her interlocutor hung up. It turned out that it was Weina's friend, who for some reason did not fully listen to the blonde. The girl, cursing and angry, continued to scream, being alone in a large apartment. While Vi Inin tried to figure out where her brother was, Li Weijin watched as his protector stubbornly tried to defeat her opponent. Song Shuren's eyes reflected a variety of emotions, all of them extremely negative. The same cannot be said about the dreamer Patricia, who looked closely at the brunette and smiled openly, clearly believing in her victory. The girls jumped up, flew into the air, and began to perform all sorts of tricks they were capable of. Our guard tried her best to destroy Patricia's staff. She tried again and again, but nothing worked. The girl froze for a moment. It seemed to her that a young man was standing behind her and calling her by name. With fear in his eyes and a trembling voice, the young man asked his protector how she felt and if everything was okay. The answer didn't take long to come, but it wasn't the answer the boy was expecting, as the girl threateningly asked why he was still there and ordered him to leave. After thinking for a moment, she said that if the knife had really lost its power, then she could not guarantee the destruction of the illusionist, and this was only possible if the illusionist himself died. Looking into the guard's eyes, the young man thought that when the illusionist died, his fantasy would dissipate on its own. But it seemed as if he was trying to live forever, because, with his hands in his pockets, he looked intently at Patricia, obviously pleased with the result. Song Shuren decided to try again, but this time she was interested in a plump man, and she thought that if she attacked him, she would have little time to save the guy. Patricia's owner turned to our security guard with a smile on his face and asked if the beauty was really so afraid of losing the young man whose life she was fighting for. But without waiting for an answer, he began to laugh loudly and gave free rein to his imagination. She reacted with lightning speed, drawing attention to the fact that her rival had sped up and was running towards the owner. The red-haired illusion, grabbing her staff with a smile in her eyes, rushed forward, but not towards the brunette, but towards our hero. Song Shuren couldn't believe her eyes when she saw her opponent heading towards the one she was supposed to protect with her own life. The girl saw Patricia, holding a staff in one hand, looking bloodthirstily towards the young man, as if not daring to take the next step. Keeping a smile on her face, she raised her weapon and turned to the young man, saying that this time things would be different and she would not allow him to protect the guard. The girl aimed a blow with all her might towards our hero, who at that very moment lifted off the ground and flew away somewhere. Song Shuren couldn't believe her eyes. She didn't understand how Patricia could make such a decision, and most importantly, why this guy decided to sacrifice himself. It felt like time had stopped. Genuine fear was visible in the girl's large eyes. She was thinking about only one thing, the guy she was obliged to protect. Seeing the young man hit his head on the ground, the girl screamed loudly, calling him by name. This sight was extremely frightening because a staff blade was sticking out of the guy's chest like something out of a fantasy story. All this clearly preoccupied the fat man, who, turning to the brunette, triumphantly declared to her that now she, too, knew what it meant to lose someone close and dear. The red-haired illusion looked at the lifeless body of the young man, but there was no joy or satisfaction in her eyes. Frightened, she looked at her master and called him. However, before the man could say anything, something incredible happened. The one who had been lying on the ground a second ago rose up, leaned his hands on the ground, and looked in the direction of the offender. There was confusion on his face. The blade was still stuck in his chest, but he seemed to feel completely healthy. The most surprised of all was his protector, who couldn't believe her eyes and, turning to Li Wai-jin, asked how he could remain alive after everything that had happened. Raising his index finger to the blade, the young man looked at it carefully and then answered the question with a question, wondering what exactly was wrong. The next second, our hero touched the tip with his finger. It began to glow, decrease in size, and dissolve, and the guy smiled, claiming that it was just an illusion. He finally relaxed and looked into the eyes of the guard, who still hadn't come to her senses and was watching what was happening with surprise. Song Shuren still couldn't believe that a doll could have abilities superior to her own. The girl repeated that the red-haired illusion had very small hands, but she was able to rotate the wedge and easily break the enemy's back with one movement. Still not believing what had happened, the guard asked our hero questions about whether the girl was actually an illusion or whether, perhaps, she seemed quite real to the guy. But the guys didn't have time to finish because the very next second the fantasy took off again, ready to strike again. However, a second later, something inexplicable happened because the one who just a few moments ago was going to kill everyone was sitting on the ground, covering her head with her hands. And those who were watching everything from the sidelines smiled joyfully, turned to the girl from the fantasy, and told her that they were not afraid of anything. 3 children stood in the schoolyard, our hero among them. They were all happily eating lunch and engaging in pleasant conversation, and it seemed Li Wai-jin had decided to tell them what had happened to him, namely, that some time ago he sat hunched over, turned to his guard and told the girl that he had simply dreamed of a terrible weapon in the form of an illusion that was supposed to disappear. And then this guy noted to himself that everything really worked out. Everything happened the way he wanted. Song Shuren still didn't understand him and continued to explain to his protector that this whole fight was just an illusion, and in fact the girl was not a girl, but a child. As for the man who calls himself the owner of this red-haired girl, he is her creator, but at the same time, he is an old man, although by no means a middle-aged man. And while our heroes were engaged in a lively conversation, the one who was the subject of this conversation told the overweight man that she would never forgive him, but did not specify who exactly. However, a second later, she changed her mind and screamed loudly that there would be no forgiveness for those who threatened her master. Our hero, who until recently had been carefully examining the guard, now turned his gaze to the red-haired beauty and studied her carefully. The young man turned and walked away, thinking about his plan of action. Just a moment later, the powerful and steely weapon that the fake girl had in her possession melted, turning into tiny fragments. Something happened to the young beauty. Her steps weakened, and soon she fell to her knees, unable to rise. The illusory beauty froze in some incomprehensible pose. Her breathing slowed, and with each passing second, she looked more and more like a doll. Lee Jin noted that the one who hunted him could no longer crawl or walk even an inch. Then he paused briefly and, smiling, as if waiting and maintaining the intrigue, said that all this was happening for one simple reason. The young man did not specify which one exactly, but explained that this is exactly how this illusory beauty should look. True, after a minute something changed in our hero. He looked at the girl with a sympathetic gaze, and then, turning his gaze to the owner, asked if this child was really so important to him. The owner's eyes showed panic and confusion. He wanted to say something, but he kept stumbling, unable to find a word. But Lee Jin, keeping his voice calm, continued to explain the whole picture of what was happening to the plump man. He said he would probably want the girl to fight for those in need. And again, after a pause, I wanted to name the reason, but for a while I was immersed in my own thoughts. The next minute these thoughts became even more obsessive. The young man looked into the distance in horror, and drops of blood splashed around him. The reason for this was the death of the owner, who fell face down on the ground and lay in his own pool of blood. Turning to the guard, our hero noticed a knife in her hands. He was outraged by what was happening, and she, with complete calm, declared that the girl was an illusion, and they should be destroyed. The brunette added that such an illusion is very dangerous because it has a high degree of imitation, and it will copy everything it is ordered, but the guy should not be surprised by this and the sight of blood. Our hero's protector, screaming, explained to him that it remained a complete mystery to her how the young man had managed to increase the level of materialization of everything he desired in one night. But, unlike the girl, with whom he apparently wanted nothing to do, he didn't seem to care. Turning to Song Shuren, who stood with her back to the guy, he asked if the girl considered the red-haired girl a human. And then, with tears in his eyes and pain in his voice, he began to reproach the brunette for the fact that, without any regret, she ended up with her so easily and quickly. A few seconds later, something unexpected happened to the guy. The owner, who had been watching the whole time, shouted at the top of his voice that his fantasy was not dead. Hearing this, the guard looked at the man in surprise, not understanding what he wanted to say. Just a moment later, the fat man's strong hand grabbed Song Shuren and, turning her slightly, threw her somewhere into the distance. The girl hit the glass with great force, on which there were already marks indicating that the brunette had been injured. The beauty slowly began to roll onto the floor, leaving behind a rather impressive trail of blood and a dent where her face had been just a second ago. Seeing Song Shuren lying on the ground, Lee Jin quickly rushed towards his protector, loudly shouting her name. And at that moment, the big man continued to tell everyone that some people told him that Patricia could not be killed, and therefore they would never be separated. Supporting the guard with one hand, our hero listened attentively to the intruder, timidly wondering who he was. With a smile in his eyes, the owner joyfully told the children that soon illusion and reality would unite, and a completely new world would be created. The man mentioned a child, and Lee Jin seemed to still understand who he was talking about. The guy noticed that he once saw a very beautiful blonde, who she was remained unknown, but with a joyful face the fat man confirmed the words of the young man, spoken by him a second ago. He continued to stare at his master with wide eyes, thinking over everything that had been said. The young man was shocked by this, as well as by the fact that he had a bloody guard on his hands. It is unknown how much time passed, but the city was already in semi-darkness. Dark figures resembling people appeared on the roof of one of the buildings. There were two of them. One looked like a man in a cap holding a gun in his hands, and the other looked like the girl who had recently helped the fat man escape from security. The couple was clearly hatching some kind of devious plan, tracking down someone very important, but it was difficult to say who exactly, and the girl noted to her partner that the time had not yet come. The next moment she uttered the word brother, although it was very difficult to say to whom exactly it was addressed. After some time, the owner sat down in front of the large screen, recalling how in the old days he was called a solitary hermit, although he was convinced that this was not true. Looking at the video of his red-haired fantasy, The man kept thinking that he had never seen this girl before, even though she was always by his side. The fat man was convinced that he was capable of much, and therefore he was sure that the day would come when this girl would come to him. He remembered her lying on his bed, dressed in a maid's costume, and thought that, despite everything that had happened, this beauty would forever remain by his side. This man kept replaying the moment he met her in his mind and remembering what wonderful times there had been before. However, suddenly, such vivid memories were replaced by the sad thought that everything was over, and in a way that he could not even dream of. The large man felt the barrel of the gun to his ear and heard a voice asking if he wanted to lose his girlfriend again. The man didn't understand whether this was all an illusion or was really happening, but the image of a beautiful blonde appeared before his eyes. The next moment, blood splattered in all directions, and the owner continued to catch himself wondering at what point everything went wrong. Lying in a pool of blood on the floor, he remembered his fantasy and thought that he just wanted to control everything and always be in charge. Remembering the red-haired beauty for the last time, the illusionist suddenly thought that together they could create a world in which they would always be happy and live forever. The long evening, gradually turning into night, was not over yet. Only the place where the boys found themselves had changed. It was now a hospital. Yu-ji, he, and Lee Y-jin were sitting in the waiting room. The girl thanked him and said that she was alive thanks to him. When Song Shuren got injured, the boy didn't lose his head, quickly called his teacher, and she, in turn, responded immediately. An ambulance arrived on the scene a couple of minutes later, and a nurse ran to the victims, trying to do everything possible right there. After thinking for a bit, the girl said out loud that now they attack the defender first, and this is extremely unusual, but at the same time frightening. Looking at Lee Y-jin, the beauty heard the young man suddenly begin to apologize. The girl did not understand what he had done wrong, and so she began to calm him down, proving to the young man that he was not guilty of anything and that everything had happened as it had. However, this guy covered his face with his hand again and said that nothing would have happened if it weren't for him. Looking carefully at the young man, the nurse considered his words, still not understanding what he had done wrong. The very next second, our heroine got up from her seat and headed somewhere, but before that she asked the guy to wait a few minutes. Those few minutes turned into an eternity for our hero, because, immersed in his thoughts, he was again transported to the events of that evening. The young man blamed himself for his uselessness and for not helping his protector at the right moment, but, on the contrary, distracting her. But it was at this moment of thought that Lee Y-jin was interrupted by a voice informing him that Song Sure and was in room 30 and that he could visit the patient. Not understanding whether the girl was conscious or not, he ran down the corridor, but, stopping in front of the right door, he hesitated a little. The young man looked confused. He didn't know whether he should enter the room alone or wait for the nurse who had disappeared so suddenly. Our hero chose the first option and, after a few seconds, slightly opened the door and began to look inside through a small crack. On the sofa, with her back to him and her face to the large window, sat his protector, the one he could not protect. Without turning around, she turned to the young man and asked him to button the top of her underwear. The young man froze in place, his eyes wide, not understanding whether he had dreamed what she had said. But before he could come to his senses or say anything, the brunette explained her request by saying that she couldn't reach the clasp. The young man, still hesitant to approach the beauty, looked at her with the thought that just recently she had done everything possible to protect him. But Lee Y-jin didn't dare say anything. He silently called his mentor, wishing for her to come as soon as possible. Realizing that the pause had dragged on, the young man walked timidly toward the wounded girl, leaving the door open behind him. He sat down carefully on the sofa behind his protector, examining her bandaged wounds and abrasions. Finally deciding to do what Song Shuren had asked him to do a minute ago, the guy asked how exactly the bra should be fastened, all the way or not. The next moment, the beauty's eyes widened and darkened with surprise. It seemed the girl was expecting someone else. Turning around sharply, she saw a young man sitting next to her and called out to him loudly, as if making sure that it was really him. The guy was overcome with surprise. He opened his eyes wide, looking at the guard, not understanding what had happened. The young man looked extremely stupid because he was holding one side of the panties in one hand, so that part of the beauty's chest was exposed. Realizing that something had gone wrong, our hero abruptly dropped his underwear, raised his hands, and cried out in surprise. He wanted to say something, but the guard got ahead of him, loudly ordering the young man to leave her room. Leaning over so that the young man would not look at the girl, she continued to scream, demanding that he leave the room immediately. However, the guy who had just a minute ago decided that he would never touch the guard's underwear again, grabbed the straps to start and finish what he started. The girl didn't seem to understand what was happening, so she fell silent for a second and decided to wait to see what would happen next. At this point, the young man continued to fiddle with the belts, telling the brunette that another second and everything would be ready. And indeed, a moment later the guy finished his plan, then took the girl's outerwear and offered to help her get dressed, realizing that perhaps she wouldn't be able to do that either. Lee Wai-jin thought that everything would be easier if the brunette agreed, although she did not do this, and again began to scream and asked the young man not to touch her. But this time, Lee Wai-jin also did not listen to the beauty and therefore turned her around so that the girl could slip her right hand under her arm. Finally, the guard calmed down and began to do what the young man suggested. She raised her hand and slowly began to put it into her sleeve. It all happened quite quickly and simply because the next second one part of the body was partially covered. But before our heroine could even begin to insert her left hand, she was overwhelmed by another storm of emotions. She couldn't understand why she had subconsciously given in to her instincts and protested again. The young man, not wanting to continue arguing with the guard, allowed her to do everything herself, but at the same time asked how well she would cope, considering the wounds inflicted by the enemy. It seemed he was right, because the next moment Song Shuren's face distorted with pain, it became clear that it was very difficult for the girl to do all this, although she did not give up, hoping for a good result. But the results were negative. No matter how hard the brunette tried to get dressed, nothing helped, and instead she stretched out on the sofa, turning towards our hero. The guy wasn't at all embarrassed by this turn of events. On the contrary, he laughed and, wanting to defuse the situation a little, told the brunette that for an older brother who lives and helps his sister with everything, helping the girl with dressing wouldn't be a problem. However, the guard didn't like this statement. Irritation and anger were visible in the girl's eyes. She didn't understand how such an intimate act could be natural for a young man. Perhaps Lee Wai-jin was right to remember his sister, because at that very moment, Wai-na was running down the corridor, trying to find the young man. The girl wanted to come as soon as possible because she didn't understand what had happened. It was news to her that her brother was in the hospital. The young beauty considered her brother an idiot, because if he had thought sensibly, then no unpleasant story would have ever happened to him. As for Lee Wai-jin, looking at the beautiful body of his protector, he noted that despite his fragility, he already had so many scars on him, testifying to the fight with the commanders. While helping Song Shuren change her clothes, the young man was tormented by the thought of whether this girl would continue to despise him, because he could create an illusion at any moment. Although the guy was interested not only in this, but also in why the girl decided to change clothes since she was in the hospital. Besides, it was already dark outside, which meant it was too early to go anywhere. Having asked this question directly, the young man received a terrifying answer, since it turned out that the brunette was going to fight with someone. And although our hero's face clearly showed amazement, the guard explained that the young man himself had heard that some driver was carrying out someone's orders, which meant that the whole world was in danger, so it was too early to sit down. The beauty further suggested that this man probably had close allies, so it was necessary to use the available time as efficiently as possible. The man understood everything perfectly, but decided to remind his lawyer about her condition and what she had experienced just a couple of hours ago, but she just waved it off. Perhaps he would have ignored everything that was happening, but not in this case. The young man said that he would not leave the guard alone. And so, the very next second, with anger and fury in his voice, he shouted after the beauty and demanded that the girl immediately undress. He convinced Song Shuren that she was a patient, so she should change into suitable clothes, lie down, and rest. To stop the girl, Lee Wai-jin walked up to her and began to unbutton the buttons on her coat, first unbuttoning the top part of the garment. A quarrel broke out between the young people. The young man continued to convince the beautiful woman that she had to stay, although she resisted in every way, telling the young man that he shouldn't interfere in matters that didn't concern him. It seemed like Lee Wai-jin had no intention of backing down, as his actions clearly showed his intention to stop his protector at any cost. The conflict resulted in Song-shi and lying on the floor with her coat unbuttoned, and the young man leaning over her, carefully examining the brunette's bust. At that moment, each of them was thinking about something of their own. The girl's eyes widened in amazement, and it was difficult to read the emotions in the young man's eyes. After a couple of seconds, the guy stood up, but despite this, the young man continued to hold on to the top edge of the guard's coat. At that moment, Vaina appeared in the room, holding the door and carefully watching what was happening. The picture was extremely strange because on one side there was a half-naked girl, and Lee Wai-jin towered over her. Since the coat only covered the brunette's back, everything else was visible. One could suspect a not entirely decent act. Realizing how Lee Wai-jin looked in this situation, he turned sharply to his sister and was about to say something to her. However, for some time the boy still stood silently, carefully looking at his sister, so timid and innocent. Gathering his courage, our hero tried to explain something, but instead, isolated phrases came out of his mouth, the meaning of which was extremely difficult to understand. Vaina, who had been carefully looking at the boys, also realized this. She indicated with her hand that her brother's vague explanations had not had the desired effect on her. The fair-haired beauty raised her hand. She clearly did not intend to wait for an explanation, since she thought that everything was clear to her. The next moment, the sound of a slap was heard in the room, so loud that it seemed to be heard, if not throughout the entire hospital, then at least in the nearby wards. Lee Wai-jin, who had closed his eyes until then, opened one slightly to see what had actually happened, as he was fine. The first thing that caught the young man's attention was the strange face of Song-shi, who continued to sit in her seat. Judging by the position of his sister's body in her hand, which was already pulled to the side, he realized that Vaina had decided to punish not him, but the girl, who had already suffered quite a bit this evening. The brunette raised her hand and placed it on her cheek. Confusion was evident in her eyes. Fear could not understand what she had done wrong and what her mistake was. This situation was incomprehensible to our hero, who did not take his eyes off the victim. At this moment, Vaina looked menacingly at her opponent, as if to make it clear that it was dangerous to play with her. Rubbing her wrist, the blonde finally broke the silence and threateningly told Song-shi and that she didn't care at all what she did. The most important thing is that this does not concern her brother, who immediately began to defend the guard, declaring that the girl saved him from certain death. However, Vaina was not going to stop. She continued to shout and accuse the brunette, claiming that if she wanted to protect her brother, she could do it, but the main thing was that the guy was not around. Song-shi had already suffered enough, so she didn't want to explain anything and somehow found excuses, so the girl preferred silence. The young man realized that his sister was mistaken, so he rushed to tell her about the events of that evening, but was faced with accusations that he knew nothing about what really happened. Vaina, who had been looking at her rival the whole time, suddenly turned around and turned her attention to her brother, her eyes full of tears. The blonde explained that her older brother couldn't even begin to imagine what she had to go through and how long she waited for him. She continued, explaining to the guy that she was sitting alone in a dreary apartment, that no one needed her, and that she was simply worried about her older brother, who never came and never came. And she immediately asked why he was not interested in her feelings, since she was his younger sister. Perhaps this guy would have answered this question, but the next second he saw Vaina's figure quickly jump out and disappear behind the front door. While the guys were frantically sorting out the situation, our nurse told someone that she would try to talk to someone, but she was sure that the conversation would not be easy. Our heroine convinced her interlocutor that she would do everything possible to convey to the girl the essence of what was happening. And, having finished the conversation, the red-haired beauty thought for a minute. The girl stepped outside, and saw Vaina immediately rush out of the next door. The teacher, thinking she'd have to convince the blonde of something, quickly stopped her. A second later, Lee Wai-jin appeared, trying to call his sister, but he only saw a girl hiding from him and getting into a passing car. The boy didn't know how to explain to the nurse that he heard him, so he stood up and simply waved his hand, and the nurse did the same. The red-haired beauty asked the guy, or rather, stated the fact that she and her sister are very close. A few minutes later, the conversation in the ward began about going on vacation and retiring for a while. Song Shur-in, who was mentioned, did not understand how she could leave her job during such a difficult period, how she could not fight, because this is the meaning of her life. However, our nurse, who started this whole conversation, said that the girl should obey, since this was not her whim, but an order from above. However, the brunette did not give in and continued to protest, not realizing that she was unlikely to achieve anything with such behavior. Yu Ji-hee, towering over her, tried to look more convincing as she began to question her deputy about whether her knife had lost its power. And then she repeated the same thing, but as a fact, telling the girl that she had lost the ability to get rid of drivers, and therefore planned to fight without her main weapon. Song Shur-in, softening a little, asked her colleague if she would report the events of the past day to her superiors, but she shook her head. The red-haired beauty once again tried to convince the girl that the knife was the guard's most important weapon, and if it didn't work, there was no point in fighting. There is no knife, no result, and risking one's life like this simply doesn't make sense to anyone. Song Shur-in lowered her head and closed her eyes, realizing that she could no longer fulfill her duty, and this greatly depressed her. But she was most interested in a completely different question, so in a timid voice the girl tried to ask it, turning to her colleague, and asked if from now on she was really no longer a security guard. But the next moment, a young man, who had also been in the room all this time, intervened in the conversation and called out to his teacher. The young man reminded the assembled girls that he knew how to dispel illusions, which meant that he would have no problem fighting the driver. The beauties, who had been busy with each other all this time, suddenly turned to the guy and began asking in surprise what he was talking about. Scratching the back of his head, the young man said that he had already managed to get rid of all these people before, so in theory he remained silent for a while, and then added that he could become a weapon for his defender, trying to convince the girls that he was right. Song Shur-in looked at the boy with confusion, pain, and disappointment, but there was also hope in her eyes, and so she carefully listened to his every word. Lee Wai-jin continued, noting that as far as he understood, his job was to eliminate the drivers, and why wouldn't it work if everything worked out well last time? Apparently, the guard couldn't listen to what this guy was suggesting, and so he kept yelling at him, claiming that he was talking complete nonsense. However, the guy did not give up and hastened to tell Yu Ji-hee that one day he succeeded, and everything was very simple. He thought that it was a real illusion. He remembered the whole situation with the red-haired girl from his fantasies, remembered how, before touching the blade, he thought that he had to get rid of this weapon. And the most interesting thing is that immediately after this something happened that I did not expect for myself. Such a powerful and formidable weapon disintegrates into many small pieces in just a few seconds. It seemed like this argument would drag on for a long time, as Song Shur-in did not accept this position and continued to look menacingly at the young man. She turned to him again and asked the young man to stop making her laugh by saying some incomprehensible things. For a moment, there was complete silence in the room. The brunette continued to look intently at the guy. And then, lowering her head, in a quiet voice, she told the young man not to underestimate the work of the guards. But a moment later, what had happened a few minutes earlier disappeared, as the beauty again began to call our hero names, saying that he was the driver himself, which meant that there was no place for him in her room. The young man, pressed against the wall, looked in bewilderment at his defender, who cursed him again and drove him out of the room. Not wanting to hear any more, Yu Ji-hee decided that it was really best for the young man to leave at this point, so she raised her hand and escorted our hero to the exit. And when the man walked out the door with an interested look, she began to ask her deputy about something very interesting. And this is related to what that guy said earlier, convincing everyone that he can easily turn any reality into an illusion. The nurse didn't understand how this could happen, so she asked the brunette again how the young man had managed to destroy the other's illusion. The girl was so sensitive about her job as a security guard that she couldn't come to terms with what was happening, so she screamed that everything that happened was just a coincidence and nothing more. Looking off to the side, she once again pointed out that, most likely, the interesting situation with the destruction of the fantasy was an ordinary accident. Our nurse didn't seem to believe the deputy sheriff's words, so she asked the girl again if she really thought it might not happen again. But the conversation didn't end there, because a young, stylishly dressed blonde man appeared in the room and looked closely at the beauty. The girls also studied the guy carefully, not daring to say anything or break the silence that had reigned. But most of all, our guard seemed surprised by this meeting. It is quite possible that she did not even expect such a thing to happen. But the guy didn't notice the beauty's surprise, because with a tired face he said that the ability to materialize one's illusions is a plus for a conductor, and the ability to dispel them is a minus. And after finishing the last sentence, he pulled out a jug and quickly threw it to Song Shuren. The girl took the gift, examined it carefully, and, perplexed, asked the young man why he had brought her canned tuna. However, the man didn't seem to hear the question and, sitting across from our nurse, told her that this guy was truly unique. If he really could do everything, then the guards wouldn't have to fight anymore. The man explained to the girls that perhaps Lee Wai-jin would become their new weapon, and if so, he needed to meet this young man. This explanation satisfied everyone except Song Shuren, as the girl became indignant and shouted that the driver had never been a member of their team and could not become one. The guard also noted that for some unknown reason her knife had stopped working and asked to replace it with a new one. Song Shuren told the young man that the area they were in was dangerous because they still hadn't managed to find the illusionist who ordered all this, and they hadn't managed to catch the one who killed him. After a short pause, the girl bowed her head and said with sadness in her voice that if she didn't hurry, she would be late. She didn't have time to finish because the young man got ahead of her and asked if she believed that something made her stronger. The chief also asked the girl who she thought was responsible for turning the weapon, imbued with divine power, into a useless kitchen knife. A second later, taking the bladed weapon in his hands, he added that the guard should know that the knife's power comes from its owner, who possesses powerful psychological strength. The man did not give up, as if testing Song Shuren, and added that she herself had destroyed a precious national treasure, and after all this, she still dared to ask for something. Touching the blade and looking at the girl dispassionately, he asked if she wanted him to give her a new weapon. Without waiting for an answer, he pronounced the verdict that the guard had done her job well, and now congratulated her on her retirement. Then he turned and walked towards the door with the same impassive expression on his face. The young man opened the door, paused in the doorway for a second, and then quickly left, leaving the beauties alone. Everything happened so quickly that Song Shuren didn't even have time to say anything. Various thoughts and questions were spinning in her head, but there was no one to ask them. The girl sat on the bed, depressed and upset, looking devastated. It seemed as if this short conversation had destroyed absolutely everything. The first rays of the sun burst into the room, but the brunette continued to sit in place, without taking a single step. With the same sad and depressed expression on her face, the girl realized that she had only one way out, but she decided not to say which one out loud, even to herself. And indeed, the day was in full swing, the weather was wonderfully sunny outside, and there was a wonderful mood in the air. On the kitchen counter sat a blender filled to the brim with a smoothie containing homemade yogurt and fresh strawberries. There were also other dishes on the menu, including a special sandwich with organic vegetables and egg-covered chicken breast. But that was not all that was on offer, for the oven light was on and something was cooking on a baking sheet. A minute later, people wearing gloves took out a baking sheet on which the freshest croissants were laid out. They were fried and had such an aroma that you could smell it even on the street. There was simply an enormous amount of delicious food on the table. No doubt, whoever prepared it all was considered a true gourmet. Much to the surprise of many, Lee Wai-jin was behind all of this, talking to himself and stating that all the food he cooked was what his sister liked the most. With a smile on his face and enthusiasm in his eyes, the boy believed that thanks to such a step on his part, his sister's opinion would change. He remembered how the girl flew out of the hospital room, tears glistening in her eyes, and the young man really wanted his beloved sister to smile again. The guy might have been about to think about something else, but the next second he froze in place, his expression won a surprise. There was nothing strange about this, since Vaina was standing in the doorway in her school uniform, indicating that she was about to go to class. Seeing her brother, she lowered her eyes and hesitantly greeted him, wishing him good morning. However, the next second the blonde turned abruptly and left. It was perfectly clear from the expression on her face that she did not want to continue this conversation. Li Wai-jin followed Wai Noi, but before he could say or do anything, a second later he was already looking at the closed door through which his sister had disappeared a second ago. The young man was clearly upset by this turn of events, as he was just getting ready for a morning meeting with his sister. So, worried, he continued to think about what he should do to fix everything. Having carefully examined the table, filled with food for every taste and need, he decided for himself that now this guy was not capable of anything else. A moment later, the young man, dressed, stood at the door of his apartment, realizing that he also needed to go to school, otherwise he would be late for class. After leaving the apartment, Li Wai-jin felt someone's presence in the hallway, but he didn't pay much attention to it. But it was all in vain because the next moment someone's hand grabbed him and almost put a knife to his neck. Just in case, the stranger twisted the young man's right arm behind his back, probably fearing his reaction. The guy, not understanding anything, froze in place, but the next second the stranger's voice brought the blade to his throat and warned him not to try to do anything. Our hero tried to get a good look at the attacker, and if up until that moment he was convinced that the criminal was a man, then, upon hearing the voice, he realized that it was a girl. The young man, having gathered his courage, spoke to the stranger, telling her that he was not a celebrity and, moreover, had not done anything that could make anyone want to take revenge on him. Our hero managed to turn his head slightly towards the criminal, and at that moment the guy had an idea. Turning further and looking into the kidnapper's face, Li Wai-jin began to shout that most likely she was a driver hunter. The beautiful young brunette lifted her cap slightly, probably so that the young man could get a better look at her. However, he didn't have time to say anything, because the guys quickly left somewhere, moving further and further away from our hero's house. The girl followed Li Wai-jin, pushing him forward, guiding him, and showing him where to go. Sometime later, the young man lay on the floor, his belongings scattered around him. Confused, he tried to look around, but couldn't figure out where he was. Li Wai-jin cursed as he realized that the kidnapper had taken him to an unfamiliar room. Gradually coming to his senses, our hero began to note individual objects so that a certain picture would form in his head. And it worked because all the furniture and all the personal belongings, including underwear scattered everywhere, also indicated that this was a real girl's room. Our hero rightly noted that the room was not in the best condition, as there was a lot of garbage and used sheets lying on the table and floor. Despite the chaos, the young man's attention was drawn to something else in the far corner of the room. The kidnapper, who had already managed to remove the cap that concealed her beautiful hair, followed the young man's gaze with horror and realized that he had seen something he should not have seen. Wanting to prevent the inevitable, the girl quickly rushed to the young man and ordered him as loudly as possible not to look. However, it was all in vain, because our hero managed to see a framed photograph standing on the bedside table. Grabbing the guy by the back of the head and leading him somewhere, the girl, stuttering, began to ask the young man if he had managed to see the photograph. The next second, Li Wai-jin felt like a naughty little child who couldn't hide the consequences of his misdeeds. Therefore, the young man thought for a long time about what to say, carefully examining the back of the girl standing in front of him. Taking a deep breath with sadness in his eyes, he told Song Shiran, his kidnapper, that he realized who the people in the photo were idols, a group of 5 true titans of their time. And then, in a softer voice, he said that she was probably a real fan, since she even had autographs from these guys. Our hero thought to himself that Song Sure-in was a completely ordinary girl and asked her out loud what she was doing now. The young man smiled sincerely. It seemed that he was amused by the whole situation, and the girl said that she was now in the process of kidnapping him. Without any rudeness, our hero's former protector stated that her boss was now on the side of the young man with superpowers, and then, as if between the lines, added that their boss wanted to meet with our hero. After some hesitation, Song Sure-in added that her knife had lost its power, meaning she could no longer fight, and said that she hoped to receive a new weapon, but their leader refused her request. Slightly embarrassed, the brunette said that she had kidnapped the guy with the sole purpose of exchanging him for a new knife. Lee Wai-jin, who had been sitting in the corner of the room all this time, listened attentively to his former protector, but he couldn't tell if she was serious. The girl, taking a thick cord in her hands, added that the guy would need to be tied up for a while so that he wouldn't even think about escaping. Otherwise, negotiations with the authorities would fail. A moment later, our hero jumped up and began to convince his guard that more gentle methods could be used, since tying him up would not help resolve the situation. The young man, still looking at his captor, who continued to hold the rope in her hands, smiled. An idea seemed to have occurred to him, and he said that everything could be resolved quite peacefully. However, this state of affairs did not suit Song Sure-in. She shouted irritably that she would hold the guy hostage until she was given a new knife, and that a peaceful solution had nothing to do with it. True, the young man decided not to argue and calmly said that the girl simply needed to prove that she could fight without her own strength. And, as if to show his generosity, he turned to the brunette, adding that he would do everything possible to ensure that she was reinstated in her position and could once again begin doing what she loved. Squeezing the rope, the brunette looked attentively at the young man, as if considering his every word. In the bright rays of the sun, her face appeared even more beautiful, but at the same time it was impossible to read anything on it. Song Sure-in noted that the young man was an arrogant driver, and upon hearing this, his mouth opened wide in surprise. In the very next moment, our brunette turned her head and in a stern voice ordered her captive to follow her. The boys went out into the street, bathed in bright rays of sunshine, and then the former security guard told one of them that she wanted to visit him. After some time, the boys found themselves in front of a playground where many children of different ages had gathered, but the oldest were not even 6 years old. The young man seemed to be very happy about the outing, because he was beaming with happiness and said that he really liked children, and at the same time, I asked my interlocutor what she thought of them. However, the girl ignored the young man's questions and simply pointed somewhere in the direction of this place. The man watched closely as the kidnapper moved forward, but did not understand where she went or what she was going to do next. In the very next minute, our hero stopped, looked into the distance with horror in his eyes, and asked the girl what was happening. A few meters away from the guys stood an incomprehensible monster, unlike any animal in the world. So when the young man saw this monster, he thought it was someone's illusion. He wanted to say something else, but the next second he covered his mouth with his hand, demonstrating obvious disgust towards this creature. The girl explained to Lee Wai-jin that they had destroyed this fantasy many times, but despite this, she comes back and continues to wander around the kindergarten. But the most unpleasant thing is that the guards do not know who created her. Raising his hand to the back of his head, the young man thought for a moment, and then asked the girl if she thought that the two of them could handle this monster. And then, with some apprehension in his voice, he said that such a monster had no place in this world, and although ordinary people could not see it due to its weak materialization, it still had no place here. The guy stood there and didn't dare say or do anything, because he probably relied on a more experienced person in this matter. Our hero looked closely at the monster, thinking about something of his own, but still not daring to continue the conversation or start battle. Song Sure-in was also silent, waiting for something or thinking about her next steps, both her own and Lee Wai-jin's. The very next minute, a tiny boy's face appeared from behind the fence. Seeing him, the brunette thought that this boy was the leader. Lee Wai-jin seemed to not understand what was happening. He looked after the running child and embarrassedly asked the girl if she was wrong in her assumptions. The very next second, trying to catch up with the boy, the girl screamed that children do not distinguish between illusion and reality, and that she knows many child illusionists. And, without looking up from the young man, she added that such demonizers are much more dangerous because security guards, teachers, and administrators underestimate them. The young man hesitated for a moment, shouted something to the brunette, and asked her to stop. Looking at the child who turned around, the young man asked the former security guard if she was really going to kill the child just because he was driving. Looking at the blue sky, Song Shu-in quickly responded, stating that if the boy was harming reality, then she must obey the order and detain him. Our hero began to appeal to the brunette's common sense, convincing her that the child had no time for anything and therefore should not be touched. Apparently, the girl had seen many similar cases, so she calmly asked the guy if he was really going to wait until he did something serious and irreparable. The beauty's words angered the young man, and he continued on his way with anger in his voice, not understanding how the former guard could be so cruel. This argument could have gone on for a very long time, but the next second, tearing his gaze away from Song Shu-in, the young man looked somewhere to the side. Right in front of him stood a young girl. Her clothes made it clear she was a schoolgirl, or maybe even a high school student. She looked cute because she was hugged by the boy they had just been chasing. It seemed like the girl was familiar with our hero, as she asked him if he was really Wai-na's older brother. The young man was a little embarrassed, not knowing what to answer, and began to mutter something under his breath. This situation also discouraged Song Shu-in, who was closely watching the events. Without waiting for an answer, the blonde turned to the young man again and asked him the same question as a minute ago. After carefully examining the girl's face, he realized he knew her. The beauty's name was Iwon. He'd seen her in the cafe where his sister had brought the guy against his will. The young man timidly began to justify himself, saying that he remembered the girl, but had forgotten her name. However, it turned out that she didn't care at all. She just stood and smiled at our hero. Suddenly, the baby hugging the girl looked sharply at her and asked who this young man was. Squatting down to look the child in the eyes, the girl told the little one that this was Wai-na's older brother, whom he knew well. While Iwon was talking about her older sister, our hero looked away with bewilderment and horror in his eyes. Thousands of thoughts were spinning around in Lee Wai-jin's head, but he couldn't organize them, so he couldn't fully formulate his main idea. Although the main thing he was thinking about was that he had completely forgotten about someone who shouldn't be forgotten. And it wasn't Wai-na, as one might think, but Song Shu-in, who had threatened to act as ordered just minutes ago, and then suddenly decided that she was unlikely to harm a child. The young man noticed that the former security guard turned around abruptly and headed towards where the young beauty and her brother were standing. However, our hero was not going to give up so easily, so he quickly ran up to the boy, hugged him, and started shouting at Song Shu and that this was unnecessary. The brunette watched this whole situation with bewilderment, not understanding what the young man was going to do. During this time, the guy continued to hug the baby, telling everyone that he was the cutest child and looked very much like his sister. And in conclusion, he added that he never thought that children could be so charming. And in order to somehow protect the child, he informed everyone present that there was a lot of fine dust in the air, and therefore it was better to stay home in such weather. The air was absolutely clear, even though a beautiful evening was approaching over the city. But it turned out our hero didn't care. He asked the girl to take his brother and just go home. Having handed the baby over to his sister, he again tried to explain to the boy what fine dust was. Iwon and Iwon had already walked quite far away from the guys, but Lee Wai-jin did not calm down and continued to shout that they had better hurry home, but they would definitely see each other again soon. He concluded by adding that it would definitely be a crowded place, perhaps a city park or square. A moment later, Song Shu-in spoke up, clearly displeased with what was happening. The girl demanded an explanation from the guy, and he merely asked her what she intended to do. The brunette looked in amazement at the young man to whom she had explained everything she knew just a few minutes ago, and yet he was still asking questions. Our hero was furious. He shouted at his friend and explained to her that she could not harm such a little boy, especially in front of her own sister. Looking into the brunette's sad eyes, Lee Jin, simultaneously asserting and questioning, asked if the guards were really that insensitive. The man lowered his head just as the former security guard approached him, took his hand, and asked him to follow her. But as soon as the brunette walked away, the young man noticed that something began to fall out of her pocket. The young man looked intently at the girl. He was very interested in what she had in her pocket. For a second, it even seemed to him that there was a knife in there. But a minute later, all his doubts were dispelled, because on the ground lay a bright candy, sealed in a thin film. The guy didn't expect such a turn of events, so his eyes widened to incredible sizes in surprise. The girl looked at the candies scattered on the floor, and the young man studied her carefully, not daring to say anything. In the next moment, the brunette turned and ran away from our hero, who was chasing her and trying to ask her something. Lee Jin shouted her name again and again, forcing the beauty to stop, but he only heard the girl's refusal and request not to follow her. With each passing second, she moved further and further away, and the guy froze in place, not knowing what to do. When the guard disappeared, the boy's stupor finally passed, and he bent down and picked up the lollipop. After some time, the young man managed to catch up with the brunette, who by then had already acquired a light gait. Finally, out of breath, the guy called out to the girl again. The weather outside was, as always, magnificent, but the little one had no time for it because he was telling his sister that they had been served curry in the garden. The child enthusiastically told his older sister that he had eaten all the carrots in the dish and had also behaved very well. However, Iwon didn't hear him. The girl was completely immersed in her thoughts, from which even the child's voice could not bring her out. A minute later, the beauty spoke, but then again plunged into her thoughts, wondering if Song Shun was really the girl Lee Jin loved. The boy, who had been holding his sister's hand tightly all this time, looked at her with amazement, not understanding who she was addressing or talking to. In an instant, his question shocked the girl. He asked if she really liked this young man. Next, Yuan asked her directly if she loved this guy more than her own brother. Hearing these words, the girl sat up and hugged the baby tightly, so tightly that he felt her love and care to the fullest. Sitting on the ground, she said that for her this boy was the most important person in this world. Continuing to hug him, the blonde reassured him, promising that they would always be together and she would never dare abandon the child. These words clearly had a positive effect on the baby, who within a minute was smiling and rejoicing at the arrival of his sister. At that very moment, somewhere on the other side of the city, having reached a playground, Song Shun was riding on a swing. Lee Jin still managed to catch up with the fugitive, and turning around, the young man began to apologize, calling the situation a simple misunderstanding. His words clearly offended the brunette, who turned around with anger in her voice and told our hero that her job was to calm the child down, since any mistake or wrong move could anger him. It became clear that the special textbook says that illusionists first need to eat something and then check whether they are human or not. However, her entire carefully thought-out plan was thwarted by the actions of the young man. He, in turn, was not thinking about work, but about the fact that brunettes, who were considered the best guards, were also prone to shyness and blushing. Turning to Lee Jin, the girl wanted to explain something else to him, but seeing his smile slightly hidden behind his hand, she screamed angrily and ordered him not to laugh. The guy decided not to take her words seriously, so, waving his hand, he happily declared that he knew how to find an approach to anyone. And if this is so, then he wants to do something, but for this he asked Song Shun and not to interfere and to give him one day to conduct the experiment. Sitting on a swing and smiling, our hero explained that he has no equal when it comes to communicating with children. The young man added that he would do everything possible to check whether the child was really an illusionist and would then report the results to the former security guard. A new school day has begun, which promises to bring many interesting and even unusual things. Our hero was walking down the corridor, clearly trying to find someone, and, seeing a familiar sign, stopped. A second later, he was already looking into the classroom where his sister and Yuan were studying. The young man clearly intended to remain unnoticed, but he failed. The boy was noticed by his new friend, who, following him out of the classroom, asked the young man if he was looking for Vainu. The young man clearly did not expect such a question, so he hesitated for a few seconds, not knowing how or what to answer. The situation was saved by the same Yu1, who, without waiting for an answer, simply informed our hero that Vaina was at the first aid station. Remembering this room and thinking about something of his own, Lee Wai-jin asked again, with surprise in his voice, where his sister was. With horror in her eyes, looking somewhere into the distance, the blonde asked the teacher not to do what she was about to do. The red-haired nurse touched the girl's leg, but gently reassured her, telling her that everything was fine and she had nothing to worry about. Standing behind the naked Vaina, she said in a soft voice that if the girl was a little more patient, she would receive pleasure that she had never dreamed of before. Lee Wai-jin, who only imagined it, began to scream and resist everything that was happening. Kneeling in front of the class, he wondered where this incomprehensible illusion came from in his head, but he still had doubts because the guy knew that the red-haired nurse was not as simple as she seemed. Not understanding what was going on, Yu-won rushed to calm the young man down, saying that Wai-na was just feeling dizzy, so Lee Wai-jin shouldn't worry so much about his sister. And then in a quiet voice, she added that her friend was incredibly lucky because she had such a wonderful older brother who cared about her more than he cared about himself. The girl smiled shyly and continued talking about her friend, reassuring the young man again and again. However, he asked not to tell him anything else and told the truth that he came to class not to Wai-no, but to Yu-won. The very next minute, the young man became interested in what she does after school and what her plans for the future are. The beauty blushed. She could not believe her ears and realized that the young man was clearly inviting her on a date, noting his courage and gentlemanly qualities. Realizing that he had put the girl in an awkward position, Lee Wai-jin quickly retreated, explaining that he did not need one as much as her younger brother, whom he wanted to meet. Realizing that this sounded extremely strange, the young man tried to shower Yu-won with compliments, explaining that the boy was very cute and he would like to play with him some more. It seemed that Yu-won didn't quite understand his intentions, as she started yelling and accusing the guy of having an abnormal love for boys. Embarrassed and blushing, our hero explained that the girl had misunderstood. He hadn't thought anything bad about the child, and he simply needed to meet Yu-won. Looking at the young man, the beauty thought for a moment, and now it seemed to her that she herself had put him in an awkward position. Smiling, the beauty told Lee Wai-jin that she would see her brother after school. Looking the guy intently in the eyes, the girl said that she planned to pick up her brother after class, so if the guy wanted, he could join her. Meanwhile, in the first aid station, a conversation took place between the nurse and Vainoi. The red-haired beauty, leaning her hand against the wall, said that the current situation was very interesting. What's interesting is that the student who ranks first in school is skipping classes, and she chose an incredibly unusual way to do so. She hid in the first aid station. The teacher then asked Wai-na if she was hiding something from her that she didn't want to admit. Looking closely at the nurse's legs, Wai-na said that she actually had questions, and besides that, there were many things she hadn't talked about, and she would like to have some of them answered. The blonde was most interested in what was happening to her brother and why he had changed so much lately. Looking into the girl's eyes, Yu-ji, answering the question, said that, reaching for the glasses lying on the nightstand, the mentor was clearly thinking about how best to explain what was happening in her brother's life. Having adjusted the frame, the red-haired beauty began to slowly, from afar, inform our heroine that her brother. And with the next sentence, she finished by saying that Lee Wai-jin was chosen as the hero who would save this world. Vaina, still sitting on the chair with sadness in her eyes, asked if everything that was happening was dangerous. The teacher didn't believe that the girl really understood everything, and she only said in a calm voice that her goal was to understand all of this without any prejudices. She continued sadly to say that at the moment she has too many unclear moments that she cannot understand on her own. After some hesitation, VN decided to ask the second question, which tormented her no less. Taking a deep breath and looking directly at the nurse, the girl asked what her brother was threatening and whether he was really threatening him. Yuji didn't respond right away because she thought that if she laughed at her sister and Lee Wai-jin, They would give up and quickly leave, but that wasn't supposed to happen. And so, looking at the evening sky, the red-haired beauty realized that she would have to answer something, because changing the subject in such a situation would no longer help. While Vaina continued asking questions, her brother and his new friend arrived at the kindergarten, where, in addition to the children, many parents had gathered to take their children home. Upon seeing his sister, Yu-won joyfully ran up to her, extended his small hands, and began to greet her loudly. Yu-won sat down next to the little boy and began asking him with interest about how his day went and whether he listened to the teacher. Lee Wai-jin, who was standing behind the girl, thought that he could not allow this child to be killed even if he himself was the organizer, and so he decided to devise some kind of plan. But while he was gone, the young man resolutely approached the child, bent down, and asked if the baby would like to play with Lee Wai-jin. The boy, who was laughing and smiling just a second ago, turned into a serious and dissatisfied child. Turning to Lee Wai-jin, Yu-won told the guy to pretend, and after a short silence, added that he thought the young man was an idiot. And just a second later, Yu-won screamed and told our hero that his sister loved him more than anyone else, not Lee Wai-jin. The young man tried to explain something to the child, but the child jumped up on one leg, made faces, and said that the young man had been abandoned. He deserved it, and losers should leave. Our hero didn't give up, so he turned to the boy again and again, not understanding what he meant when he said that he was a bad guy. Suddenly, a girl intervened in the conflict, bowed her head, and in a gloomy voice began to ask her friend for forgiveness, and also to say that the boy had been raised incorrectly. With sadness in her voice, the beauty explained that their parents were no longer alive, and she loved the child too much, although she understood that she should treat him much more strictly. Turning his gaze towards the kindergarten, he said with understanding in his voice that everything was fine, and then asked the girl to leave. To avoid sounding rude, Yu-won explained that when younger brothers run away, it means they want to be watched. He continued purposefully, adding that when children cover themselves with blankets and ignore adults, they do so to attract attention. The girl was surprised by the young man's knowledge in the field of psychology, but it turned out that she liked it. The next minute, the young man asked the girl for her phone number so he could write his number down in the phone book. She didn't understand why this was necessary, but she still agreed because she didn't see anything strange in it. However, Lee Wai-jin immediately explained that he would wait for a call from the girl when she found her brother, since he was also worried about the boy. In the end, Yu-won thanked him and said that she would definitely call him back once she met her brother. The guy, keeping an eye on the blonde, was wondering whether he should go with her to look for the child or whether it would be better to refrain from doing so. The hero realized that the boy was very angry, which meant that following him was dangerous, and at the same time he thought about the child's words, not understanding why he called him a loser. The young man was so absorbed in his thoughts about how hard it was to be older sisters that he didn't notice the wolf following him. Lee Wai-jin, not knowing where to go and where he could be of the greatest use, nevertheless decided to return home. Our hero was still walking along the quiet and deserted street, looking into the distance and unaware that a threat was following him. At that very moment, Song-shiren flew towards him faster than the wind, clearly sensing something was wrong. And something bad is about to happen, because the wolf chasing our hero began to growl and grin. In an instant, the dangerous and vicious animal was thrown aside by those who were in such a hurry to save Lee Wai-jin. The young man, having fallen to the ground and realizing that someone was lying on top of him, again did not understand what was happening, because just a couple of minutes ago, everything had been so good. After catching his breath a little, the young man raised his head and carefully examined Song-shiren, calling her by name. Looming over him, the former security guard screamed and told the boy that he didn't need to look at her, but rather that he needed to destroy everything behind them as quickly as possible. Looking at the boy carefully, the girl said he must destroy the creature threatening them. The boy did it yesterday. He must do it today, because that's the downside of possession. Lee Wai-jin looked closely at the monster, not believing his eyes and not understanding where it could have come from. After carefully examining the wolf, the young man told his girlfriend that this monster was not an illusion. While Song-shiren was outraged, our hero continued to remark to the two that he couldn't believe that the wolf was an illusion since it looked so realistic. Apparently, the former security guard didn't care at all because the next minute the girl grabbed a knife and ran towards the wolf. She understood that her weapon had lost its power, but the brunette was obsessed with this creature, and whatever it was, she decided to destroy it. Looking at all this, the young man did not understand how material realization of such a high level could occur. However, to finally dispel all his doubts, Song Shuren called out to him and asked him to carefully watch what would happen in the next minute. In the next moment, the wolf's head turned into something incomprehensible, reminiscent of a snake's nest, but without a head. The young man stood and looked in horror at everything that was happening, and, despite the fact that he had already seen a lot, he was not prepared for this. With sadness in his eyes, he thought that this was impossible in real life, and so he realized that he had to act. The young man sat down on the ground again, concentrated, and, turning to himself, said that this was an illusion of the real world, and there was no place for a monster in it. Song Shuren, who had her back to our hero, saw the fragments flying in all directions. Finally turning to the young man, Song Shuren asked how he was feeling and whether he was injured. Without answering the question, the young man got into an argument with the girl, after which the guys, as usual, began to deal with the uninvited guests and their illusions. However, the very next moment, the girl accidentally misspoke and told the young man that if she had not followed him, something irreparable would have happened. Li Wai-jin thought he heard something wrong, so he began asking the girl if she really had decided to do such a thing. Blushing, the former security guard didn't know what to do or how to justify herself, since the young man would probably misunderstand her. But, to her great surprise, the very next moment the guy began to smile, close his eyes, and sincerely thanked the beauty. For a while the boys stood in silence and looked at the place where this terrible illusion had recently been. And then, admiring the beautiful sunset, Song Shuren asked the boy what he had done that had angered the child and caused the beast to attack him. While the guy stood there pondering her question, the girl offered new ideas, asking the young man to carefully recall his last or second-to-last meeting with the child. At first, nothing came to our hero's mind, but then he remembered a recent incident when that guy called him a loser. However, he decided to keep quiet about it, telling the brunette that nothing like that happened, except that the child was very cute and was unlikely to be involved in what was happening. So Li Wai-jin continues to look after the child. The evening was in full swing, so Vaina decided to relax a little, drew a bath, and thought about something for a long time. Her thoughts returned to a recent conversation with a nurse who had called the girl very smart and sensible. She also remembered the third question she had asked the red-haired beauty. Would the girl be able to help her brother, since she couldn't just sit and watch him try to save the world alone? In answer to this question, the nurse smiled, addressing the brother and sister with as much love and tenderness as possible, and then asked the girl to make sure that her brother had returned to reality and was fully aware of what was happening. Continuing to sit in the bathtub, the young beauty seemed not to understand the meaning of these words, so she thought about them again and again. Suddenly her thoughts were interrupted by a phone call, which Vaina couldn't help but answer. On the other end of the line, Yuwon's voice could be heard, clearly about to tell her friend something important. The blonde's eyes widened when she heard that they were talking about her older brother. It was already quite late in the city when Li Wai-jin, having finished all his business, returned home. The young man opened the door as quietly and silently as possible so as not to wake his sister if she had already gone to bed. But, upon entering the room, the young man saw his sister sitting on a chair and telling her brother that her friend had called her. When he learned from Vaina that Iwon's brother had been found, he was very happy, although he did not understand why the girl had not called him back, since he had left her his phone number. The blonde didn't believe her brother and asked the guy again if her friend had really given him her number. And then Vaina looked at the guy with some sadness in her eyes, but from her facial expression, it was difficult to understand what she was thinking at that moment. However, the very next moment, she openly asked her brother if he really liked girls like Iwon. Li Wai-jin began to justify himself, saying that it was just a coincidence, and furthermore, he declared that he belonged entirely to his queen, that is, his sister. However, A second later, realizing that he had said something wrong, he began to apologize and make excuses again. Suddenly, the guy heard his sister's offer to introduce him to the girl better. Throwing the towel off her head, Vaina said that she would definitely introduce the guys and formalize their relationship. The next morning, when he went into the bathroom and found Vainu brushing his teeth, our hero thought that this time the punishment had gone too far. The guy started talking to the girl and timidly explained that even if she didn't introduce him to her friend, she would still remain his only queen. However, in response to her brother's comments, the girl only laughed and said that he had again misunderstood everything. After some time, the guys were already in the corridor and were getting ready to go on a pre-planned walk. Before leaving, Waina handed Li Wai-jin an interesting cap and put on his head. The young man was not used to wearing such things, and besides, he did not understand why he needed it. So he timidly and hesitantly began to turn to his sister. He made it clear that he didn't want to wear that cap. But Waina, in turn, with a proud expression on her face, said that if he didn't like the thing she bought especially for him, she would go and give it to someone else. Realizing that he was upsetting his sister, Li Wai-jin began to apologize, shouting that he actually really liked the cap and would always wear it. Opening the front door, Vainan nudged the guy and told him not to hesitate because their mutual friend was probably tired of waiting. Before the meeting, the girl decided to tell Li Wai-jin a little about her friend and began by saying that Iwon has no parents, as they died in a car accident. The girl went on to note that it was very difficult for her friend because she had to shoulder the responsibilities of raising a child, and in addition, she missed school from time to time because her brother was sick and there was no one to look after him. As he boarded public transport, Li Wai-jin noticed that everyone around him was looking with interest and admiration at his younger sister, who was actually very beautiful. At the moment when Vaina was telling something very important, it turned out that her brother was not listening to her, and this made the girl very angry and upset. However, after just a minute, the brother and sister continued discussing the baby, whom he one loves so much and for whom he does everything possible. For Waina, the news that her friend was so attentive and affectionate to her brother came as a surprise, but she decided not to tell Li Wai-jin about it. Soon the brother and sister found themselves next to an amusement park, which seemed so majestic and huge. Vainan noticed her friend from afar, so she quickly approached her and asked how long she had been waiting, but it turned out that the girl and her brother had also appeared a couple of minutes ago. And one, turning to the little boy, asked him to say hello to Vainoi, whom the child knew so well. The girl smiled as kindly as she could, leaned toward the child, and then, turning to him, said that the boy had grown up a lot since they last saw each other. Li Wai-jin, who had been watching this entire scene, watched Yu-won closely. The young man wondered if the little girl would decide to harm his sister, and he wondered with horror how that was possible, considering she was just a small child. Finally, the baby's shyness disappeared completely. He smiled, addressed Vainia as his sister, and said that she had become even more beautiful. The girl didn't expect to hear this, but she was incredibly happy that such a small boy noticed her attractiveness. Vaina, flattered by such recognition, whom the child dragged to ride the carousel, said that a real man already lives in this child. Caring for his sister and possibly the young seductress, Li Wai-jin tried to stop the girl and prevent serious consequences. He noticed Yu-won turn around and stick his tongue out at our hero, his expression clearly showing anger and some kind of rivalry. Although the baby did not show it to others, he smiled happily and said something to the girl when they were together. Yu-won and Li Wai-jin had no choice but to stand there and just stare at the boys who had left them a moment ago. Our hero, carefully studying the boy, began to be convinced that such a charming child could not have created such a terrible illusion, which meant that someone else was behind the monster. The boy didn't understand who it could be, but he was glad that the child had accomplished the almost impossible. He had given Vine a true happiness. The next moment, Li Wai-jin heard the voice of his new acquaintance, who, as if by chance, offered him to ride something too. The guy immediately responded to this desire and, smiling at the girl, began to help her. And a minute later, the boys headed to one of the attractions, wanting to treat themselves to something unusual. While some were riding, others were taking care of business. They were Song Shuren and our nurse, Yu Ji-hee, and the topic of discussion turned to the red-haired beauty's comments regarding housing for our former security guard. Song Shuren asked the girl why she came, and she replied that she needed to discuss something very important with the former security guard. She then added that a new member would be added to the team soon, and management stated that one person needed to be fired immediately today. The brunette immediately remembered the wolf that Lee Wai-jin had recently killed and asked the teacher if we were talking about the owner of this beast, but received a negative answer. The nurse then noted that we were talking about a humanoid creature that is very dangerous and must be destroyed. Even though several hours had passed, our heroes continued to have fun in the park, and little Yuan was pointing out to the kids which rides they would go on next. Lee Wai-jin didn't like this idea the most, as the young man was too tired from active recreation in the company of child. But Vainu was not at all embarrassed or tired from such a walk, despite the fact that the girl was wearing high-heeled shoes. Her whole appearance indicated that she was completely satisfied with everything and sincerely enjoyed her day off. Seeing her brother's condition, the blonde asked if the young man had enjoyed walking around the amusement park. Without wanting to make excuses or explain anything, Lee Wai-jin told his younger sister that he was completely satisfied with everything. With a smile on her face, Weena added that if a guy was interested in her, his expression should radiate joy, and, in addition, he should remember that she came to the park only because of him. Lee Wai-jin wanted to say something else, but why not turn to Yuan, who offered the girl a ride in the cars with him. And One, who had been watching her brother and sister all this time, noticed that her friend loved her brother very much and took care of him in every possible way. A minute later, the girl declared that her younger brother was also captivated by Waina's beauty and kindness, and, moreover, by the fact that she seemed so happy and loved to him. After thinking for a moment, she added that most likely her younger brother did not love her, and perhaps even secretly hated her. Lee Wai-jin, who was standing next to Yuan, didn't understand what she was talking about, but at the same time, she decided that now was not the time to ask questions. Unlike the boys, Yuan felt great as he sat on the bench next to Wainoi and said he had a wonderful day. However, the beauty's thoughts were far from reality, and the girl believed that at this stage her brother could do absolutely whatever he wanted. Vaina even thought for a while that her friend could become her brother's wife, although she did not approve of such a choice. The blonde didn't even notice that she was saying all her thoughts out loud, and Yuan heard it all and asked the girl if she thought his sister liked Lee Wai-jin. For a moment, the blonde thought that the child didn't really like this state of affairs, but she dismissed the thought, saying that if his sister was happy, then he was happy too. Vi didn't like this answer. She noted to herself that the boy was saying very adult things, although the next second something began to change. Yuan suddenly stood up from his seat and said that Lee Wai-jin should only think about her older sister first. What happened next is beyond words, as the child pounced on Vainu, threw her onto the bench, and began strangling her in a rage. Looking at the girl, he laughed and smiled, continuing to say that his sister should be in his life, not Waina. Our heroine tried to scream and break free, throwing the boy away from her, but he squeezed her throat so hard that he left her no chance. Yuan continued to joke with a smirk in his eyes, saying that if he killed the girl, Lee Wai-jin would be freed forever and would be able to choose her own destiny. Vaina couldn't understand how such a sweet boy could instantly turn into a monster who wanted to destroy her. Our heroine screamed and writhed. She did everything in her power at that moment. The girl decided to take advantage of her last chance and started yelling at the child not to touch her brother. As the boy looked at his victim in surprise, a warrior with a sword appeared behind him. She approached as quickly as possible and the next minute began waving her weapon, clearly wanting to protect the blonde. Yuan, who had been sitting on the seat of Waina's bicycle just a few seconds ago, suddenly accelerated, jumped, and seemed to hang in the air. Taking advantage of the moment, our heroine rolled over onto her other side, trying to get up and get a better look at what was happening. A minute later, Vaina sat there, stunned, trying to comprehend what had happened, but still unable to figure out who this child really was. There was a young man standing next to the girl who helped her up and kept apologizing to her. The next second, the man turned to the warrior and informed her that they did not have a neutralizer with them. And, looking at the boy, he continued that if she suddenly saw something, then they would both have serious problems. And the unsuspecting Lee Y-Jin and the beautiful E1 continued their conversation, during which our hero tried to find out why the girl thinks that her brother hates her. She told him timidly that she was not the best sister, and even less that she was not a role model. But a moment later, she sank into deep memories and began her story. At school, the girls were animatedly discussing the new brand presented in the shopping center, as well as its promotions and, in general, their planned purchases for the near future. Ewan's classmates persuaded her to go for a short walk with them and relax. One of the girls, standing behind, told everyone that their friend would most likely not be able to go because she had a younger brother whom she had to take care of. And one confirmed this, stating that the child was still small and therefore needed care and attention. The girl explained that after school she needed to pick up the boy from kindergarten, and only then would she be able to do her own thing. But before she could explain the whole situation to her friends, she noticed that she was left alone in the classroom, as all the girls had gone shopping. Yuan sat all alone by the iron gate. The boy cowered, either from fear or from the cold, because it was already completely dark outside. The next second, the child caught up with his sister and, with joy in his eyes, ran towards her, wondering why she had come for him so late. However, instead of a warm hug, he received a slap in the face and a reprimand for the fact that his sister is just the one who picks him up from school every day. The girl turned away from the boy, not wanting to see his confusion and lack of understanding of what was happening. And one, not wanting to explain anything, simply turned her back to the child and went somewhere, leaving him standing in the same place. The sun was out again, indicating that the students were excited about the new school day. More precisely, they were already seeing him off, since the classrooms were empty and everyone was getting ready to go home. And one, who was also about to follow the example of the others, suddenly turned around when someone called her name. Turning around, the girl heard someone say that her younger brother had come to see her. A crowd of girls gathered around the little boy, discussing such a sweet and charming child. They couldn't believe that their classmate had such a handsome brother. Finally, having separated from the girls, the little boy looked at his sister with joy and amazement and called her. Smiling, the boy said that the girl comes to him every day, and this is not entirely true, but if so, he decided to surprise her and come to her himself. But instead of understanding and joy, she was met with shouting and insults. And one told the child that she hadn't asked him to do anything like that. Turning away from her brother and blushing, the girl thought only that the baby had put her in an extremely awkward position. The child watched his sister leave and turned to Vanya and asked if his sister thought she was more comfortable without him around. However, Vanya hastened to calm the baby down, telling him that in reality, everything was not so simple. His sister was tired, and he needed to give her time. As for E1, she ran away as fast as she could, driven by her own thoughts, which told the girl that she was tired of everything. She was still young, so she wanted to live the same free life as her classmates. Tears glistened on the beauty's face. She cried and could not stop, repeating to herself that she no longer wanted to live the way she had lived in recent years. One night, Iwon woke up thinking about her part-time job, then turned to her brother and said that the food was already on the table, after which she turned around and left. Yuwon asked his sister where she was going, but when he didn't receive an answer, he continued to sit alone, looking at the closed door. Despite the fact that it was the dead of night in the city, the girl, taking a small bag, wandered off somewhere, seemingly not understanding where she was going. However, the next moment the beauty stopped and thought that she had become too angry and had acted wrongly towards her younger brother. A few minutes later, the girl stood on the threshold of her house and joyfully shouted to her brother that she had brought his favorite Korean sweet pancakes. However, there was no one in the room, and so the girl screamed again to make sure the boy heard her. Not finding him in the living room, Iwon decided to look into the bathroom, and opening the door, asked again if Iwon was there. However, the picture that opened before her eyes plunged the girl into real shock, which could easily be read from the expression on her face. Still standing in the doorway, The blonde drew attention to the child's head, slightly peeking out from under the water. She couldn't believe her eyes, because in the bathtub, filled to the brim with water, lay the lifeless body of a child, and next to him, a hair dryer was floating in the water. The next minute, Iwon was telling someone that her brother had been electrocuted, and investigators said the child was likely trying to dry his hair. Her interlocutor, Lee Wai-jin, listened to the whole story, not believing it could have actually happened. He realized the girl blamed herself for leaving the child alone at home that evening. The beauty added that the incident with her brother was a revelation for her. Thanks to this whole story, she realized how much she loved Iwon. Lee Wai-jin was literally rooted to the spot where he stood. The young man couldn't comprehend everything he had heard a couple of minutes ago. Continuing to stand in the park, our hero asked his friend questions about his brother again and again, because he really wanted to figure everything out. And while some were peacefully chatting, others were waging a real battle, in which a man took part, saving the guards from the evil child. Sambi's partner ordered him to go to them immediately, and the protector declared that she would handle the child herself. And if at first he denied everything, then, realizing the complexity of the situation, he calmly wished Yun Somi good luck and asked the girl to be extremely careful. Finally, the young man warned her that the child's material embodiment was incredibly detailed, which meant that the guard would have a hard time. And at that very moment, at the other end of the park, Iwon continued her story, explaining to Lee Wai-jin that she had resurrected her brother because she couldn't imagine her life without him. That was why the baby became what he became. And that was why he entered in a battle with Yun Somi, who was fiercely trying to resist the little monster. For a moment it seemed that the guard had succeeded, as the child began to lose strength and froze. In addition, the group's leader began to take part in the destruction of the baby by aiming and shooting at Yuan. But, to the great surprise of everyone present, the desired effect did not occur. The boy, smiling and raising his hand, informed everyone that he had already died once, and therefore could not die a second time. The battle resumed, but this time all the ghost boy's anger was directed at Sambi. The young man, who had seen something similar many times, knew that the baby was very strong, which was a great rarity. For a moment it seemed that everything had become quiet when the child, carefully raising his hand, began to examine something. Perhaps if the boy's sister had seen everything that was happening, she would have resisted somehow, but the girl explained to Lee Wai-jin that she had been able to revive animals since childhood, but people just hadn't noticed it back then. The guy noted to himself that his girlfriend was most likely a guide who couldn't distinguish between illusion and reality, but it didn't seem to bother her at all. Realizing that her story might sound extremely strange, the girl, a little embarrassed, began to apologize to our hero, telling him that he might not believe her, but she still wanted to be as honest with him as possible. And then, hesitating a little, she continued and said that, most likely, for a number of reasons, the young man did not understand her. The beauty wanted to say something else, but the next minute she saw her brother walking towards her, hurrying to tell her something. As Iwon leaned over to hug her brother, the boy informed Lee Wai-jin that several strangers had attacked Wina. Upon hearing this, our hero's eyes widened, and the young man began to question the child about everything that had happened in order to gather as much information as possible. With tears in his eyes, clinging to his sister, he began to say that it was some unknown old man. He then added that the man had a strange knife which he was twirling, clearly demonstrating his strength. However, Lee Wing-jin was still puzzled as to how this could have happened and who was hunting his sister. The guy was about to ask another question, but didn't have time because Song Shuren suddenly appeared in front of him and shouted that the child was an illusion. The former guard continued to shout and explain that he had long ceased to be human. He was just an illusion. Looking at his new girlfriend, Lee Wai-jin realized that if he was a fictional character, then this girl was the real boss. And then she spoke up, justifying the appearance of the child and declaring to everyone that she did not care who he was, because her brother was the most important thing to her. The blonde's face was filled with pain, regret, and sadness. She continued to appeal to everyone gathered, repeating over and over again that she had no one left in this world except her brother. The astonished boy seemed to understand what he was talking about. even though he heard Song-Shi and asking him to get rid of the illusory child. The brunette shouted at Lil Wai-Jing that he could get rid of the fantasy, as it was the other side, an obsession, and if that was the case, then he had to get rid of it, and immediately. The young man, without taking his eyes off Song-Shi, listened attentively to her words, but was hesitant to make a decision. Taking the knife in his hands and looking at the brunette, he began to ask her why she couldn't leave them alone and why she constantly interfered in their affairs. Coming closer to the former guard, the boy looked the girl furiously in the eyes, making it clear that it was better not to touch them. However, the guard tried not to listen to the boy, since her attention was focused on Li Wai-Jin, on whom the outcome of this whole story depended. The brunette screamed that just recently this guy said that he could become her new weapon, and if this is so, then he should grab him. For a moment, Song-Shi-An's words reached our hero, and it seemed that he really did remember his promise, but simply did not want to fulfill it. The young man stood in the middle of the alley, not knowing where to go or what to do, and confusion was evident on his face. Looking at the boy running past with a knife, our hero thought that this was not a real person, which meant that he no longer had a place in this world. The young man forced himself to do what was required of him. He remembered all the tenderness of the boy, realizing that even if this child was capable of expressing emotions, touching, it did not change anything, because he was still a ghost. This radiant little boy, who brought us nothing but joy, cannot exist for our hero. But at the same time, despite all this, he is the brother of his new girlfriend, a brother whom the girl does not want to lose. There is a struggle going on in Li Wai-Jin's soul, and apparently his soul was winning because the young man understood that he could not reject the child because it was simply unacceptable. Our hero understood that the existence of this boy was so real that he did not understand how he could now force himself to change his mind and believe otherwise. And while the young man was thinking, the boy was approaching Song-Shi and at a furious speed, who mentally called out to him and asked him not to do what he was about to do. Yuan's sister also looked at our hero with pleading eyes. She hoped that the young man would make the right decision. But this decision was never given to him, despite the fact that the child was still running with a knife and young Somi was following him. Cutting through the air with an axe, at some point the girl came as close to the child as possible and waved her hand, intending to destroy the illusion. But the next moment, someone else's figure appeared next to her. It intervened so quickly that it was difficult to even see who it was. And just as the new guard was about to deliver the crushing blow, she caught a glimpse of the boy's sister leaning over his back, as if protecting the child from being beaten. Li Wai-Jin and Song-Shi held their breath, unable to believe their eyes, waiting for the long-awaited ending. The baby himself was surprised, turned his head and felt the head of his beloved sister on him. Smiling and hugging the baby, she said that this time everything was different, everything was just for him. And, already sliding to the floor, she added that she was finally able to do what the boy probably expected of her, namely protect him. Everyone present saw the girl fall to the floor. The cause of the fall was a serious injury from an axe blow. Realizing what had happened, Yun Somi first approached the deputy chief, asking if she had really eliminated the driver. Song-Shi confirmed that the girl had nothing to fear because it was self-defense, but at the same time the beauty hesitated, adding that everything was much more complicated, since the question was different. The discussion was about how the illusion of a child could still persist among them if the driver had already been excluded from the list. At that very moment, an alarm sounded in the park. Management asked all visitors to leave the rides due to the problems that had arisen. Our nurse, who was in the park the whole time and heard the warning, did not understand what was happening because this had never happened before. The girl felt that something was wrong and thought that perhaps she had come too late. But for some, everything remained as before, and so the guard, realizing that the ghost had not disappeared, decided to get rid of it again. Realizing that the boy was left completely alone and there was no one to protect him, young Somi swung again and tried to deliver a fatal blow. However, the next minute the child suddenly grabbed the guard by the arm, showing that he was not as weak as he might seem at first glance. Yuan squeezed the girl's hand so hard that she almost screamed in pain, still holding the axe in her hand. No one present understood where the boy got so much strength from, but he threw the guard aside as easily as if he were a doll. Realizing that things had gone too far, Song Shuren turned to Lu Wai-jin again, as if to let him know that their common cause depended only on this guy. She screamed and told her friend that he had to get rid of his illusions, otherwise there would be even more deaths, although this was wrong. The young man stopped for a moment and thought about something again. It seemed that he no longer understood the meaning of this word. So I decided to ask the former security guard what she meant and what she wanted to tell him. In an instant, anger blazed in our hero's eyes. Turning to Song Shuren, he told her in an indifferent voice that Yun Somi was his friend's killer. To everyone's surprise, he turned the conversation to the fact that today was as wonderful and good as it could possibly be. The young man looked around with joy and began to talk about what could be more beautiful than the blue sky, white clouds, and such a warm, welcoming sun. And then, turning his gaze sharply to the baby, he noticed that, despite all this, the girl was no longer alive because she had sacrificed herself. The young man looked at the little boy standing in the middle of the alley and declared that his sister had been killed right before his eyes. Li Wai-jin was the only one who understood the boy, and so he comforted the child, telling him that he, too, felt broken and lost. And a minute later, looking closely into Yu-won's eyes, in a calm and dispassionate voice, he ordered him to kill the villain who had so cold-bloodedly destroyed his sister. The boy seemed unable to believe his ears because his eyes widened, and there was both a question and some kind of misunderstanding in them. But there was no need to repeat this twice, because the very next minute the baby ran up to young Somi and attacked her. Grabbing the girl by the hair, he began to torture her as if she were an inanimate being, wanting to finish what he started as quickly as possible. The boy, with the strength of a beast, threw the new guard aside and abruptly walked in the opposite direction, heading toward someone else. It was Song Shuren. She was watching what was happening carefully, but she couldn't take a single step. The girl carefully assessed everything that was happening and wondered to herself how it was possible that the illusion not only continued to live with the dead drivers, but also fought with such ease, as if they were a completely real person. Looking at her fellow security guard, who was trying to catch her breath and get up, the brunette tried to understand where this energy came from in the child and how this connection was broken. And only one girl seemed to be thinking about nothing. It was Vaina, who was eating ice cream with great pleasure and enjoying the beautiful weather. The beauty sat on a bench at a small table under a canopy and simply enjoyed what was happening at that particular moment. While Vaina continued to rest, Song Shuren couldn't afford it, so she thought that if the doll moved without batteries, there must be a rational explanation. Looking at Li Wai-jin and Yun Somi, she thought that if the doll still had no batteries but was working and at maximum efficiency, then there was only one reason for that. The reason lies in a new energy source, which the boy managed to connect to without any problems. Taking a closer look at Livy Jean, Song Shay and pulled herself together and reminded herself that she had forgotten one very important thing. The thing was that among all the living and normal people, there was initially someone who did not belong to their clan, and we're talking about the leader. But before the girl had time to weigh anything, she heard the voice of the new guard, who warned her of the danger and asked her to lie down as quickly as possible. The next moment, Yun Somi's boss approached her and told her that the security guard should not say what she had just said. In a soft voice, the man reminded the girl that they were security guards, and most likely she had forgotten a little the meaning of this word. And, as if reassuring his partner, he stated that the guardians are those people who awaken others, forcing them to leave the world of illusions and change their lives. And, already looking at Song Shuren, he added that if they surrendered, the world would plunge into an endless nightmare, and this could not be allowed under any circumstances. All the wounded and battered recruits looked at their commander and, praying, uttered his name. The girl wanted to warn the young man about something, but she didn't have time because the next moment a ghostly child appeared behind the man's back. The boy thrust a knife or other sharp weapon into the back of his older colleague with such ease that it seemed as if he were simply cutting butter, rather than taking a person's life. Lee Jin was still watching this whole scene, but it was hard to tell anything from his expression. On the one hand, he was surprised. On the other, he was amazed, but what exactly this guy felt at that moment remained a big question, and most likely for him too. The new guard began to cry, but continued to repeat her colleague's name, and the latter could only say that everything was fine and add the word real person. A second later, he added that a real person would never die from any illusion, after which he fell into the girl's arms. She screamed and cried, realizing that her boss, and at the same time her partner, was no longer alive. Worried by this, Song Shurin, who seemed to have lost all hope, did not know what to expect in the future. The girl took a knife out of her pocket, realizing that it wouldn't work, but knowing that she had to do something. Standing in the middle of the road in a pool of male blood, the brunette thought about her next steps. She wanted to do the right thing. The girl wanted revenge. Our heroine's eyes simultaneously showed rage and confidence, because she understood that the guards were people who would fight to the end. Everything that happened a few minutes ago was extremely unfair, but what's done has already happened. The former guardian cannot influence the past, but she can rewrite the future because a fire burns in her soul. And so, with all the hatred she was capable of, the brunette screamed that this child was an illusion, that he was not human at all. Turning to Lee Jin, she began to tell him that all his sadness was hidden in his chest, then paused for a second and continued. She added that all his anger was unfounded because everything that happened was a lie, although he himself found it difficult to comprehend. Suddenly, Lee Jin abruptly interrupted his thoughts, looked at the beauty, and told her that he could confirm that Yuan looked like a completely ordinary guy. And seeing Song Shurin heading towards him with a knife, he continued and stated that Yuan was dead, nothing would bring her back to life, and it was also unfair. This should not have happened. The same applies to Yuan, a very ordinary boy who died a little earlier, not in a fight, but as a result of an accident at home. But before the young man could finish his sentence, the former security guard shouted that she could not allow the dead to influence reality. This means that the girl will fight for those who are still alive, doing everything possible to make the world a better place. Turning around, she saw a ghostly child quickly approaching her, intending to neutralize the brunette. A fight broke out between the former guard and the boy again. The child was still as strong as he had been some time ago. Song Shurin did everything she could, and it seemed like she remembered all the tricks she was capable of. At one point, the boy leaned over so that his hand touched the ground. At that moment, it seemed as if the girls had managed to at least temporarily neutralize the boy, buying themselves precious minutes. The brunette took advantage of these moments and, accelerating, ran forward. She grabbed a knife and, running up to the ghostly child, attacked him, plunging the weapon straight into the illusion's head. The boy looked into the eyes of his offender with an angry expression on his face, but did nothing for a while. However, a minute later he jumped up alive and unharmed, having gathered his strength to attack the brunette again. Song Shurin knew that her knife wasn't working, so she couldn't do anything to intervene in the child's situation. However, it seemed to everyone present that our heroine had some kind of plan because she looked at young Somi and asked the girl to take the knife. The new guards, with tears in their eyes and upset, seemed not to understand what was happening and did not know what they could do if everything had already been done. While one girl was thinking about Song Shurin, the other, without wasting any time, ran up to Yuan, quickly and firmly grabbed him from behind, and turned back to her colleague, urging her to finish off the ghost as soon as possible. At that moment, the boy just stood there, his eyes filled with pain, resentment, and disappointment that could not be hidden. Lee Jin, who also witnessed everything that was happening, did not hide all these emotions. Young Somi didn't understand why her unarmed colleague was risking her life, but she simply replied that the girl shouldn't worry, because the day she received the knife, her fate was already predetermined. It seemed that this story worried everyone except the young man, who was also a simple witness and did not interfere in any way while real battles were unfolding around him. While the guy was lost in his thoughts, Song Shurin asked her colleague if the girl shared her opinion about the fate of the guards. But before she could answer, our brunette turned to Lee Jin and called his name. And then, After a short pause, she asked the young man to free himself from his illusions when she left. For some time, the guy watched in amazement both the brunette and the whole scene unfolding in the alley. But the next moment, everything changed again, because, plucking up her courage, young Somi grabbed her axe again and ran towards the ghost boy. At that very moment, someone turned to a girl and began to wake her up and tell her that she was sleeping in the wrong place. So she should immediately get up and leave. It turned out that they were talking about Vina, who somehow inexplicably ended up on the bench and continued to sleep soundly while her friends fought for their lives. The girl, covered by a man's jacket, seemed confused about how she ended up sleeping on a park bench, so she began asking the security guard questions about it. He, in turn, hastened to calm the blonde and said that some kind of accident had happened on the rides, so all the visitors had left, and since the park was closing, the girl should also go home. Vina's eyes were filled with horror as she thought about everything she had heard, trying to figure out what to do next. The next moment, she ran into the depths of the park with such speed that the security guard didn't even have time to say anything to her. He just stood there and looked at the beautiful blonde, trying to understand what had happened to her. And while Vina was trying to find out where her brother was, the most terrible, but at the same time unexpected event happened in the park. The security guard finally managed to get a result. The boy's severed hand was lying on the ground. The ghostly child himself did not die, but blood was flowing profusely from the wound, although it did not seem to bother the boy at all. This did not bother young Somi in the least, who turned to the deputy director, as she called her, and asked if everything was all right with the girl. Looking at the boy, the former guard replied that she had given the order to get rid of the child at all costs, and that this was what should primarily worry young Somi. Shifting her gaze from the illusion to her colleague, the beauty continued to explain to the girl, as if hinting that the matter needed to be completed, that, most likely, they would not have such an opportunity again. Song Shuren paused for a moment and looked at Li Weijin. She felt like something had begun to change in the young man's demeanor. The young man covered his head with his hands, trying to hide from his own thoughts, which whispered to him that the boy was not really here. And what's more, he had never been here. This means that the child the young man sees has nothing to do with him. And this must be accepted, since at this stage, he is no longer a child at all. Song Shuren heard all this from her friend, who blurted out his thoughts out loud and immediately reaffirmed his arguments, adding that it was not Yu-won standing in front of them. The very next minute, something completely unexpected happened, because the girl's voice made everyone understand that Yu-won was actually a very kind guy with a big heart and a bright soul. And one looked at our heroine and noticed that her brother was waiting for her. He was so good that he couldn't even harm an insect, and what's more, he would never harm a person. The girl returned again and again to the child's best qualities, as if trying to justify him in front of everyone gathered. The boy looked at his sister attentively, but at the same time with amazement, trying to understand what was happening to him. And the beauty, in a gentle voice, turning to Yu-won, invited the baby to go somewhere together, wherever he wanted. The child approached his noble sister and extended his only small hand to her in agreement. The next moment, he joyfully shouted that he really wanted to go with her. So he literally pounced on his sister, wanting to hug her as tightly as possible and maybe even climb into her arms. The brother and sister looked at each other carefully. It seemed as if they had not seen each other for a very long time. The security guards who were watching the events unfold in the park watched with shock and bewilderment. However, after just a minute, Song Shuren started yelling at Li Weijin, accusing him of creating such a strange illusion, despite the fact that the young man denied everything. Perhaps in another time and under different circumstances, our old guard would have continued its tyranny, but given the complexity of history, it tried to weigh everything and understand who else could have done something similar. Li Weijin, realizing how complicated everything was, began to wonder who was behind all of this. But the very next moment, Vina appeared next to the guys, and she couldn't even imagine what she would see. However, she didn't see anything because she was lying on the ground with her eyes closed, and our heroes surrounded her. At that very moment, someone was discussing this, or rather, the high degree of materialization of this boy's illusion, adding that he had never encountered anything like this before. The man further noted that such ghosts live as long as possible and behave naturally for a long time. Moreover, most people recognize them without problems. Moreover, the perception of such illusions by sight, smell, hearing, touch, and taste depends on the illusionist. The man sitting in the office turned to the nurse and continued to explain to her that the fact that the machine recognized the illusion indicated an extremely high degree of its materialization. However, the child is much more serious than they expected, as he has maximum strength, energy, and endurance. Listening to the young man, the red-haired beauty seemed lost in thought. It was clear that everything that was happening was troubling her greatly. A moment later, without the slightest embarrassment, the girl noticed that the man she had been talking to was dead, and the authorities didn't seem to care. The man didn't understand what the nurse meant, and so he decided to ask her again why the girl thought that way. But without waiting for an answer, the young man continued and said that there were two problems in this matter. The next moment, he started typing something on the keyboard, clearly trying to find and open some information or show the nurse something important. A minute later, he said that the first problem was that there was no need to be afraid of the dead, although the illusion continued to grow stronger, and the second was the fact that another illusionist had taken over this fantasy. The teacher didn't understand how this was possible, but the interlocutor calmly explained, citing the example of Loch Ness's Nessie, which has been appearing periodically for 1,000 years, that there was nothing strange about their case. To make things crystal clear for He, the man explained that delusions are the result of our desires and fanaticism, and even if the creator suddenly dies, under certain conditions he can continue his work, but will choose a different object for it. After a pause, he continued and said that he once heard a story that surpassed all common sense. As if defending her student, the nurse said that it was too early to blame Li Wai-jin for everything because they needed to investigate everything thoroughly. However, the man was quick to reassure the girl that there was a second problem concerning Wai Na, as the girl had become very close to the ghost child. The young man said that Yun Somi told him that it was Wai Na who saw the dead idealist, and then turned around abruptly and asked what Yuji herself saw. For the first time, the teacher seemed to be unsure what to say or unwilling to answer, so she paused for a moment to think. However, she immediately began to talk about how the girl was lying lifelessly on the ground in the park, but she herself could not understand where she came from. Li Wai-jin rushed to his sister, and she, in turn, hurried to the young man, trying to calm him down. The young man shouted that his sister was lying ahead and needed help, but the teacher stopped him, wanting to make sure that it was really Wai Na and not her ghost. Yuji tried to explain to him that a few seconds ago, Iwon was right there, but now she is not there, but his sister is who has changed her appearance. Therefore, the girl wants to find out whether the young man is really convinced that this is a real sister and not an imaginary one. This time the teacher decided to use the word illusion, which in this case best suited everything that had happened. For a while, the girl managed to calm the young man down, although the next second an ambulance arrived to take away the victims. The nurses quickly loaded Vine Nu onto a stretcher and rushed her to a medical facility. Realizing that something was wrong with their sister, our heroes followed her to stay informed about everything that was happening. The young man pounded on the wall so hard that he knocked out a piece of putty, but he didn't pay any attention to it and instead drummed vigorously, shouting about what was happening to his sister and where they had taken her. Our hero found himself in a strange room, tiled on all sides and with one large opaque window. The guy realized that he was being seen, and so he began to threaten, warning everyone who was in any way connected with his sister that if anything happened to the girl, revenge would not be long in coming. Indeed, on the other side of the window in a room were Song Shi and Yun So-mi, who confirmed that the guy was not in the best condition. Young So-mi, turning to the brunette, asked why the guards weren't allowed to kill this guy, since he was one of them, and therefore very dangerous. Holding an axe in her hands, the girl continued her explanation and said that the guards, could get rid of the young man at any moment. Looking into the brunette's eyes, she added that this guy killed Sambi, a man who was not only her partner, but also an old friend. After carefully examining her friend, Song Shi realized that the girl was in a very difficult situation, But at the same time, she did not know what to answer, since the operation was led by her elders. The former security guard stood in the room for a while, carefully watching Lee Y-jin and thinking about something.